I'd like to welcome everybody to this June 15th meeting of the Board of Aldermen work session. At this time, before we get going, if you would join me in a prayer. Heavenly Father, we just ask that you be with us tonight and give us the inspiration and leadership opportunities to truly lead our city in all components and dynamics of where we need to go. And in your name we pray, amen. Would you join me in the pledge of allegiance to the flag of my country? I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Madam Clerk, would you call the roll?
Alderman Bingle.
Here.
Alderwoman Harris.
Present.
Alderman Astor.
Here.
Mayor Outlaw.
Here.
Alderman Kinsey.
Here.
Alderman Best.
Present.
Alderman Odom.
Here.
Well, welcome everybody. Before we get going, we'd like to lift up fellow Mayor Chuck Allen over in Goldsboro. He resigned today from office. He has had some health issues, and in going across the state for the last 7 years, Chuck has just really been a really big leader, particularly amongst the metro mayors, and I just want to thank him at this time. And I would like to start this off tonight, as far as this work session goes, in reading through all this information. I just want to go around, starting with Alderwoman Harris for a minute. I'll do the introductories of it, and if everybody would just kind of, before we get going, kind of give your flavor of what you see in this information. If there are things you see that were left off that need consideration before we even get going, so staff can kind of know where we're going. So I'm going to start that out by saying this. In reading through this information, it seemed very detailed, comprehensive. Staff did a great job. A lot of really good ideas, and particularly with the Interstate 42, Highway 70 project, there's quite a bit of funds over there. So the things that I found in this reading through it, that I want to make sure that we did equitably, was the relationship between the enterprise funds and the general fund, of who's going to pay for what and who should pay for what, and what assets should go to what departments, and the pro rata of that. I know you guys got that handled. One thing that I want to make sure, and I did see some things in some itemized items through the departments, I want to make sure, particularly with the health and well-being of our citizenry, that particular attention was researched and shown in the area of sidewalk maintenance, as far as the proper equipment needed, and that kind of tag teams with drainage. If there are particular pieces of equipment for cleaning our ditches for the future maintenance of what we're going to have in the next couple of years, I'm going to mess on how dear that is to your heart, that we make sure that's considered. So the only other things, every department in the city of New Bern is an important department for an important reason. And cemeteries, to me, is just as important as electricity or water, sewer, recs, parks and recs, whatever. So I don't know that I saw a lot in there, and I'm not trying to critique it at this point. I'm just pointing out that the respect we show our departed is just as important as the day-to-day operations, and I want to make sure we don't overlook that. Again, with respect to future trending and where our city's going, the kiosk and future billing opportunities for our citizenry that want to continue to pay in person through drive-thrus without having to go through long stack periods at the Fort Totten location, etc. I want to make sure we thought about that. But here's why I really got into this, what I'm saying. Greenville, North Carolina, a couple of years ago, was out writing police tickets with a 1950s ad, and the whole city was shut down for 2 weeks. And I think there's 174 cities in America have been cyber attacked, and those cyber attacks are up 60%. We've seen what happened with the Colonial Pipeline, etc. I don't know of anything more important that we want to make sure, with available funds that we have, that our city is protected from cyber attack throughout all the departments. I mean, think of what happened to us, that happened in Greenville happened to us. So Alderman Harris, I just wanted to bring those things out and then go around the table a minute, and then we'll get started.
Yeah, I mean, I looked over it and I see some good stuff. I probably want to just hold my comments and probably till later just to see where the flavor of the board is and working together to get things done. So thank you, I appreciate it. But overall, everything looks good.
Okay.
I do want to commend the staff. They have put a lot of thought into this, and this has been an ongoing, this capital budget. We've had this capital improvement plan for a while. It looks like it's been dusted off and tweaked a little bit. I don't think we will ever have a board in this city from now going back 50 years that didn't know that we needed capital improvements. And either you have the money or you don't. Tonight, to me, represents how do we get the money and how the money we get can give us the best bang for our buck, I guess, really, because we have needs in the city. Cyber, I mean, that's an excellent point. I think that's important. You know, drainage, we have lived through the worst hurricane, you know, of our lifetimes, I'm sure. I hope we never see anything like that again. And we need to prepare for the next one. We need to make sure our ditches are clean. We're getting some help from FEMA. The additional things with lift stations and other things, additional pumps that don't run on electricity and have battery backups. These are the important things that give quality of life to our citizens. We do need sidewalk maintenance. We need more sidewalks. We need more bike paths. We've heard from our citizens. And so we can go on and on and on. This list is not finite in any way, shape, or form. I'm sure we can find it. I think the biggest thing we need to come together on tonight is, you know, we have X amount of dollars to spend, and then we've got to decide what are those priorities that will fit into that budget. More than, this to me is everything rolled into one, and what's more important. But really kudos to the staff for all the work that they did, and I look forward to the discussion we're going to have this evening. Thank you.
Hey, Mr. Mayor, thank you. I think the staff has done a wonderful job identifying some of the capital needs for the city of New Bern. I'm definitely interested in the water and sewer infrastructure needs that's been indicated. I'm also very much would love to see some roadway improvements if at all possible, and I'm just looking forward to having a discussion.
Okay.
I think the staff have done a very good job in researching and looking to see where we're going to go within the next 2 or 3 years to make things happen, to make the city a much comfortable and a place that people would like to come to live. So to that, the planning and takes a lot of work to find out all the needs and trying to make that selection where you're going to start and how you're going to finish. So I'm waiting to see how all those things are going to develop. So that's where I'm at.
Alderman Best.
I do want to thank the staff for preparing this package of information that we're going to review tonight. This American Rescue Act plan holds a lot of grant monies. And I think that we as a city need to dive a little deeper into trying to get a lot of this grant money out of this plan. Not just necessarily what has been allotted to us, the $6.7 million. I think there's a lot more in this plan that we need to get our grant writer busy on and trying to get monies for it. And especially for firemen, I know there's two particular grants, the SAFER grant and then the firefighters grant. And that's millions of dollars. So looking over this whole plan, I got some questions, of course, and I do respect what each individual alderman presents here tonight and what their wants and needs are. But I think the bottom line is here, we need to prioritize this and see what is needed most here in our city for our citizens. And that's my main concern. And I do have some suggestions, and all of you know on this board that my concerns is with water, stormwater. I'm not even speaking on the matter of a hurricane because there's nothing that we basically can do about that. But for just normal stormwater, I think we can jump on that project, and I think we can eliminate some of the issues we're having here for some of our citizens in those low-lying areas, and I know there's a lot of low-lying areas in the city, and I'm not just specifically talking about Duffield, but I think that we need to get on board with that. And I do realize that we have 4 funds, the electric, the water, the sewer, and the solid waste, that needs some of those, particularly 2 of those funds need some real good attention to right now. So that's basically all that I have to say, and I just respect each alderman here tonight, what you present, and hopefully it's something that I agree along with you with. That's all I have.
Thank you. Alderman Odom.
Mayor, the only I guess I'll start with a question for staff on that ARP, since that's one of the first things we're discussing. How much, Mayor, are we receiving in total, and how much are we receiving broken down by those 2 payouts?
$6.7 million, and we've already received 50% of that, and we've received that in late May.
And when will the other 50% come?
In May of 2022, as of today.
Okay.
And once again, there's still a lot about that, this particular plan that's a moving target, but that's what we've been told today, that in 12 months I'll get the second half.
All right, thank you. So, Mayor, my 2 comments for the two of the topics we're discussing tonight. The ARP, obviously, it's very detailed and restrictive in what it can and cannot be used for. We've been presented with, just from Jordan's department, it looks like $6.9 million worth of projects. That does not include the water and sewer rehab for Greater Duffield, because that number is broken down by block, and I don't know how many blocks that would include. It's 200 to 500,000, or 200 to 250,000 per block. So that would be in addition to almost $7 million of projects. So that in itself would pretty much take care of the ARP funding. We also have MetroNet. I believe it's $2 to $3 million is the number we've been looking at for that. So the ARP money, to me, from an infrastructure standpoint, is pretty much already allocated. From the capital improvement plan, looking through the 5-year plan that was presented by staff, just general fund requests come in at $21 million for a 5-year plan. So what I would advise the board and caution us, we all know, we've talked about it a lot, there's an election that's happening next year. I believe, Mary, we have $6 million in available borrowing capacity, if you will. I believe that was the number that was presented. I think we need to be very careful in not overextenuating or overextending the city's credit to an extent to where a new board takes over and they could be faced with a natural disaster, a hurricane or something else, and not have any borrowing capacity in order to handle those issues. Because if I'm correct in this, if we were to approve a project tonight and that project were to move forward, I believe that the payment for any of that wouldn't even be due until 18 months roughly from now. That's all, Mayor. Thank you.
Okay, before I turn this over to Foster, I'd like to ask the Finance Director a question. When you get into an anomaly situation like the Highway 17 relocation of water, sewer, fiber optics, and whatever else, obviously most of that would be paid for out of the representative enterprise funds associated with it. When you have an anomaly situation like that, and it stresses those funds to where you're having to do some creative things like extremely high rate structures to compensate for that period of time, does ever, from a finance standpoint, does the general fund or the financing arrangements, is the general fund involved? Or, what I've always known is the local government commission says the enterprise funds have to carry themselves. So could you clarify that relationship there?
Well, technically, legally, it's the exact opposite. Am I on here? So the general fund can never borrow or use any of the utility fund money, so the enterprise fund monies, ever. Right. There's many reasons for that. The opposite is true. If the general fund would like to make a donation or a contribution to one of the utility funds, they're certainly legally capable of doing it. Not really a good idea. I wouldn't recommend it. What I have seen before and I have structured before is a loan. Sometimes the general fund can loan a utility, and vice versa. You can do loans between the funds, but they have to be structured like a bank loan, and you have to pay interest, and you got to make your payments. So I would go that route before I'd actually give them the money. But the general fund could, if they wanted to, help out the utility fund if they need to. Typically, though, you would use the rate structure to make up the expenses of a utility fund.
Mr. Kinsey?
I have a question. The MetroNet, how much money will we have to pay them?
That's a kind of a big question,
We
so
don't
at
pay
this.
them, though. We don't pay them.
Right, well, it's.
Are we paying MetroNet? We're paying for the poles.
For the
I mean-
for the
And this is-
broadband?
we're going to go into detail on this
Okay, yeah.
with that presentation.
Because I want to make sure I don't want citizens to think we're paying anybody.
But I'm just trying to find out, to
I understand
ask the
what
question
it's
from
gonna
the finance
cost.
director,
There
right?
will be some cost at this point, and Charlie we'll be talking a little bit later and can give you all the specifics. At this point, my understanding is that there will be some cost and that we intend to be reimbursed for those costs. At the end of the project, there could be some costs that are not reimbursed, and of those but in the future, as we move on, when the project's finished, we will be starting to generate revenue from them. They'll have things on we'll be charging poll costs. Is that what poll fees? Is that what poll? Yeah. So, and so we'll be able actually to recoup all the cost eventually. We may not be reimbursed 100% the day the project's over, but over the course of a few years afterwards, we should be recouping all of it.
And along with the projects that Jordan has, that the money would be coming from ARP. So how much money will be left from those two big projects?
Are you talking about the highway project, or are you talking about these other, just in general, his other projects he's asking about?
Pretty much in general, the projects
Yeah,
that
he's
he's
got
doing.
more projects, he's got larger budgets for his project needs than the ARP. We could use all 6.7 of the ARP money just for water, sewer infrastructure
Because
improvements.
And nothing has been allocated
Yeah.
yet. This
Right, that's
is
what this
presentation
meeting is for.
purpose, so everyone will understand we've got a lot of needs within the city, and so you're going to get to
Absolutely.
see several of those things.
Absolutely.
And we'll come back at another meeting and really start getting recommendations.
Once you go into that pot and start to taking money from there, let's say all 7 of us have a project that is entirely different. Somebody's going to be left out. Something's not going to be done. And then go back to Alderman Odom says, why should we extend and put ourselves out there on the limb when the next board comes in? They have a project that they want to do as well. So that's something that we have to be very careful about and respectable about. That's all I'm asking about. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to turn this over to the city manager this time.
Okay, good evening, Mayor, Alderman. Our first item on the agenda is a presentation on the American Rescue Plan funding. We have Seth Robinson with Withers Ravenel. He has been doing a lot of these presentations, and staff heard him speak, and we thought it'd be a great idea to bring him in to let him talk about this. And at the end of his presentation, we'll have a Q&A session. So.
Thank you so much. Mayor, Alderman, pleasure to be here tonight. Hopefully I can add to the conversation. I would like to actually commend you on the conversations that you're already having tonight. I know these are difficult decisions to make, and especially having the ARP funds available, hopefully help those decisions at some point in time. I don't think we'll come out of this meeting tonight with decisions being made, but hopefully an understanding of where we are in the process of the American Rescue Plan, both the money you're receiving directly, the money the state's getting, and kind of what we know right now, and some things that you can be doing, and it sounds like you're doing a lot of them already, to be prepared to use this money at the right time for the right projects. So I know a lot of this you already know, but I'm going to cover it a little bit. I'm not going to go into a lot of depth on everything here. But basically, when the guidance came out last month, it took sort of the 4 primary eligibilities and broke them down into 5. Responding to COVID-19, there's a lot of overlap there with the CARES Act and some other money that's been made available so far out of the pandemic. Responding to negative economic impacts, and I'll talk a little bit about what those are and what's included as part of that. Sorry, I'm a little tall here, yeah. Premium pay and how that can be used to potentially provide some additional assistance to essential workers. Revenue loss, which I understand from Mary, y'all have been fortunate to not be dealing with a revenue loss situation. And then investments in infrastructure, which is a lot of the things that we've already talked about tonight. So along with what is eligible for the ARP money, there's also some pretty key ineligible items for ARP. There was a couple that were called out specifically, and I think you may have had some of that in the information that Mary had given you previously. But there's some additional ones that were added in basically as part of the guidance that the Treasury put out. So the first is any deposits into pension funds, and that would be outside of normal deposits as part of premium pay, offset of reduction in net tax revenue. I've kind of told people at this point, it doesn't mean you can't lower taxes or cut taxes. I will say it's going to make your life very difficult for several years if you decide to do this during the ARP time period. I highly suspect that from the Treasury standpoint, if you were to cut taxes, they're going to lead into this from the standpoint of this is what you're using your ARP money is to help offset that. And you're going to have to do a lot of documentation to prove that that's not what you're doing. So I would say tread very carefully if that's a route that you want to go down during the next kind of 2 to 4 years that you're going to be dealing with the ARP funds. You cannot use this for debt issuance or to pay off any debt service. That was a question that came up a lot earlier. Could we pay down existing debt that's at higher interest rates and then take out newer, lower interest rate debt? You cannot use that. You can't use it for rainy day funds, any other type of financial reserves. And maybe most importantly, you cannot use it for general infrastructure spending outside of water, sewer, and broadband investments. So those are very specifically called out in eligibilities, and basically everything outside of that is not going to be eligible. So you can't use this for paving or parks or any of those type of things. That's not going to be eligible for this funding.
Excuse me, let me ask you a
Yes.
quick question. It says that you cannot use for water, sewer, and broadband. Does that include stormwater?
Yeah, so the way they actually, and I think this was actually a good call, so the way they defined sewer, they included storm sewer or stormwater in that definition. So yes, you can use that for stormwater and basically anything that falls under stormwater, from conveyance to treatment or any of those type of things. So yes, that is eligible.
Thank you.
And then you cannot use this as a non-federal match for federal programs. So if you have other federal grant programs, for instance, that require a non-federal match, you can't use this money as that match. They're going to consider it federal to that extent.
Quick question
Yes.
for you. On your number 2 slide, it says
Yes.
Investments in infrastructure, point number 5.
Yep.
And then on your next slide, it says general infrastructure spending outside of necessary water, sewer. So we're just highlighting that water, sewer, and stormwater
Are eligible,
are
but they're the only thing that's eligible from an infrastructure standpoint.
Thank you.
There were a couple exemptions to that if you had the revenue loss for general spending, but that's not going to apply in your situation. So the public health uses, again, there's a lot of overlap here with some of the CARES Act money, so COVID-19 mitigation and prevention, medical expenses, behavioral health care, public health and safety staff, expenses to improve design, execution, health, and public health programs. I think the last bullet there is probably still relevant given where we are in the pandemic. Otherwise, the most common use that I've seen from a public health use standpoint is probably looking at vaccination programs to try to do some things to try to increase the vaccination rates. So that's probably the primary use that I'm hearing from communities that they're looking for from a public health standpoint. Responding to negative economic impacts. Again, there's some overlap here, but assistance to unemployed workers, state money there, assistance to households, direct assistance to them, expenses to improve economic relief programs, small business, nonprofit, support, rehiring state, local staff. If you had staff cuts during the COVID pandemic, you could potentially hire staff back and use this money for that. And aid to impacted industries. Specifically, the guidance calls out tourism, travel, and hospitality. It's not necessarily limited to that from a contribution standpoint, but that was called out because of the overwhelming impacts from COVID. And when we talk about kind of the responses to those negative economic impacts, that's a criteria basically of the guidance. So it has to respond to those needs. So it requires you as a recipient to first identify the need, what the negative impact was, the extent of that, how that was tied to the COVID-19 public health emergency, And then identify specifically, if you're going to provide financial assistance, how that is directly related to that and how that's going to provide some assistance with those needs. It has to be directly in response to COVID-19. So you're definitely going to have to make sure we can connect the dots between the money you're spending and the COVID-19 pandemic, specifically if it's industries that were already in decline, for instance, prior to COVID-19. You can't necessarily give them COVID-19 money through this to provide additional economic support. So you have to be very clear to that. You cannot provide support that goes beyond the impact. So when you're looking at how much support you would want to give someone, for instance, in a household situation, you basically would be limited to an assessment of what the economic impact of COVID-19 has been. There has been some information provided by the Treasury that says you could use, for instance, the calculations that the government used in doing their own checks that they sent out as a benchmark or a reference. And then if you're doing these things, it also could continue to manifest. So what you see as an impact today may not be the extent of that impact. And you may want to look over more of the life of this money and the availability. So over the next couple of years in particular, as you're looking at spending some of these funds. Addressing disproportionate negative economic effects. And this was something that was really added in the guidance more than it was in the original act. So specifically it talks about, and this is probably going to sound familiar if you are familiar with community development block grant funds, because there's a lot of overlap in the type of things that the CDBG program calls out and is called out here in the ARP, but building stronger communities through investments in housing and neighborhoods. I'm not going to go through all the things that are there, but it's a lot of the kind of common overlap for CDBG eligibilities. Addressing educational disparities, so specifically it's calling out things like early learning services, providing assistance to high poverty school districts, doing some other educational based assistance. Specifically it calls out some things to help try to make up some of the education loss as a result of the impact of schools during the COVID pandemic. And then promoting healthy childhood environments, specifically talking about childcare and some other things. So one of the things I will call out for these uses is, again, very similar to CDBG. It's really very focused in the guidance on qualified census tracts. So it's looking at those areas that have very high incidences of low to moderate income persons. So very targeted in those areas. And if you have those areas and you want to do this type of work, then there is quite a bit of flexibility that falls under these things. It gets a little bit more difficult with the existing guidance of doing this work outside of those specific census tracts. Premium pay eligibility. This was something certainly of interest, I think, a little earlier in the pandemic than it is now. There hasn't been a lot of interest so far in the communities that I've been talking to, but it's very similar to what we saw in some other situations. So basically, essential workers, and the way it's defining as essential workers is those that in critical infrastructure sectors that regularly perform in-person work, interact with others at work, or physically handle items handled by others. Specifically calls out things like healthcare, education, transportation, sanitation, those type of things. There is a very clear emphasis in the interim final rule that this should be prioritized for lower income workers, and that there is really an intent with this to provide assistance to low to moderate income frontline workers for whom the cost of illness is the hardest to bear financially. So that's really kind of the methodology and the purpose that's laid out as part of the guidance. It doesn't necessarily mean it's entirely limited, but that's something I think they're going to be looking for from a reporting standpoint and a use standpoint. In addition, it's limited to an amount up to $13 per hour, in addition to wages or other benefits, in an aggregate amount not to exceed $25,000 per eligible worker. In addition, because of that tie to more low to moderate income individuals, if you're going to provide this to someone and it provides a total pay that's 150% of the greater of the state or the county average annual wage, then there's going to have to be justification for doing that. Investments in infrastructure. That was a lot of discussion, obviously, earlier. The good news is there's really broad eligibility in infrastructure, especially for the drinking water and the wastewater side of things, and including stormwater. And the good thing about stormwater is a lot of the existing funding programs that are at the state and federal level really aren't funding stormwater right now. That has not been a high priority, even if it's eligible. Because of the way they tied this money, all of those things are going to be eligible for the money that you're receiving and the money that the state is receiving. And I'll talk about the state money in a little bit more detail when we kind of get to next steps. But basically, there's a wide variety of things. The one thing it does call out is there is an emphasis on necessary investments. It's basically defined as those that are required to maintain a level of service that meets applicable health-based standards. It does call out taking into account climate change, so I think resiliency type projects would score well, whether that's stormwater, wastewater, or drinking water. Also calling out broadband service to unserved or underserved populations. There's a little catch there when we talk about that in a minute of the way that's defined currently, but looking for an adequate level to basically permit people to work or attend school remotely, and the other underlying piece of that are unlikely to be met with private sources of funds. So if there are private sources of funds to do those things, then they're not wanting you to offset those. The other thing is they really want you, if you're going to spend money on broadband, for it to be focused on non-profits, not-for-profits, co-ops, those type of broadband situations if you're going to put funding into broadband. Not limited again, but a focus. Water and sewer infrastructure eligibility. So the way they did this, they basically kind of punted to the existing EPA Drinking Water State Revolving Fund and Clean Water State Revolving Fund eligibilities. So everything that's sort of eligible in those will be eligible here as well. So anything from a drinking water side, treatment, transmission, distribution, including lead service line replacement, rehabilitation, decontamination, storage, basically everything that goes into a water system is pretty much going to be eligible. Same thing under the Clean Water SRF. In this case, clean water means wastewater. Clean Water Act is the reference for that. And basically everything including construction of publicly owned wastewater treatment works, non-point source pollution management, which would also include stormwater, decentralized wastewater systems, stormwater systems, water conservation, efficiency projects, reuse projects. So there's a real wide variety of things that you can do with that money potentially having to do with those things. The one thing I will say, since you brought it up, Mayor, it does specifically call out in the eligibilities addressing cybersecurity for water and wastewater facilities. So that is clearly called out as being eligible for these funds. For broadband infrastructure, again, a focus on unserved and underserved. The way they have defined underserved is people that not currently served by a wireline connection that reliably delivers at least 25 megabits per second download and 3 megabits of upload speed. So that's how they define the base of being underserved. So if you don't have existing wireline that meets those requirements available, then it's considered underserved, and obviously unserved if you don't have anything at all. And if you're going to put new infrastructure in, then they're looking for something that's going to meet at least 100 megabits per second up and down synchronous. So much higher speed than what's considered that threshold right now. So that's kind of the focus, and again, looking for nonprofits as a primary or cooperative situation. So timelines, that's obviously a critical aspect of these funds, to be able to use them by the times that were set up under the Act. It is a little tighter than most funding would be. The key will be the type of funding you decide to spend this on. The good thing is the deadline is December 31st, 2024 for spending these funds, but the way they've defined that is it really just has to be committed and obligated by that date. So for instance, if you want to do water and sewer projects, you really just have to be under contract for construction by December 31st, 2024, and then you've got another 2 years to expend all of the funds. So you have to the end of 2026 to expend all the funds that are there. So that gives you a little bit more breathing room, both again for the money you're receiving directly and the money that the state is going to make available as well. If you're looking at spending on existing line items, the front cutoff for eligibility is March 3rd, 2021. The one exception to that is, at least in their frequently asked questions that they're still updating on a regular basis from the Treasury, is it looks like you can do back pay for premium pay that was needed and would have been experienced earlier in the pandemic. And again, so the two dates to know is December 31st, 2024 being obligated and all funds being expended by December 31st, 2026. So in addition to the eligibilities and the requirements, I do want to call out a number of things that as it stands today are encouraged but not required. The good news is most of the things you would usually associate with federal grant money do not apply to this money. So things like environmental, things like Davis-Bacon wage rates, things like American Iron and Steel, a variety of different things that kind of fall under federal grant requirements usually do not apply in this case. However, they are referenced in some cases in this area. So they do encourage that you engage constituents, communities in development of plans to use payments. So some of the things we're talking about here tonight. So it's a good time that if you would like to engage the community to start getting their feedback on how to spend this money, it's something they certainly encourage. They encourage that you provide assistance to households, businesses, and nonprofits that were disproportionately impacted. They have some language that worries me a little bit until we get the final rule. They encourage you to ensure that water, sewer, and broadband projects use strong labor standards. So that sounds a lot like Davis-Bacon wage rates. Again, I don't like when they encourage you to ensure something. That's not the greatest language. So I hope they give a little bit of clarity as we get a final rule there, but it doesn't appear to be required at this point. They encourage you to consider projects to replace lead service lines. They encourage you to consider green infrastructure investments and projects to improve resilience to effects of climate change. Just for reference, I know the Duffy Field Stormwater Project was considered a green project under the Clean Water SRF program. They encourage you to consider ways to integrate affordability options into a broadband program. So if you're going to do broadband, that there is some type of affordability criteria that's included in developing that program from a rate structure. And they also encourage you to prioritize support for broadband networks, again, that are owned, operated, or affiliated with local governments, nonprofits, and cooperatives. So let's talk about kind of where we are in the process right now. And for better, for worse, I was with the state administering all of their programs back in 2009 when ERA happened. So I'm kind of familiar with sort of their processes as well and kind of how this works from the federal government too. So right now, obviously, we've got the money. It's starting to show up now. You've gotten your first tranche of funds with another to come 12 months from now. The state has already started receiving their funds as well. Last month, we got the guidance in the interim final rule, but where it stands today is they're actually still accepting comments on that interim final rule up until July 16th. So there may be things we talk about tonight, and likely will be things we talk about, that are not eligible as the guidance and the rule was written today, that could be eligible by the time this is finalized. And we are not likely to know that until probably somewhere in the August-September timeframe. So that's something to consider as you're thinking about the timeline of using your funds, is the clarity in what everything is going to be from an eligibility standpoint is still, it's open at this point. However, that also means that you have an opportunity to ask questions and ask for eligibilities. So because they're accepting those comments, and I look at them every day, there's individuals, there's cities, and people that are asking for things to be eligible that aren't currently clearly eligible as it stands. So you're getting, I think we said $6.7 million. On top of that, and I think Alderman Best referenced it, the state's getting a lot of money as well. And the state's money can be used for the exact same things that we talked about tonight, and only the exact same things that we talked about tonight. So that falls into these same categories. The state of North Carolina is getting $5.6 billion. We do not yet know how they're planning on using that money. So the governor came out with his recommended budget and his recommended spending for the ARP money a few weeks ago. In his recommendation, there was $800 million in grants for water and sewer projects, and there was about $1.2 billion in funding for broadband. The legislature has put out, I think, some of their initial broadband. I think it's more in the $800 million that they're looking at spending on broadband initiatives, and we do not yet have their plan for spending on water and sewer. but at least as of last week, I was hearing that there was an intent to put substantial money in from the state perspective into infrastructure. So I'm hoping that'll be out in the next couple of weeks, and we'll see what they're doing. So from a planning standpoint, again, public input. I mean, this is a really good time if you want to get public input to have the conversations, the planning that you're talking about doing right now. This is the time to be doing that, to try to come up with what your priorities are as a community. Capital improvement plans. I promise I had this up here tonight before I knew what was on your agenda, but this is the time to be looking at your capital improvement plans. Hopefully those are prioritized and what your needs are as a community. Updating capital improvement plans if they're old, refining numbers, having the discussions you're talking about having on priority, so that when it's clear of how this money can be made available, you can make sure you use your money as wisely as possible. Identify gaps between the money you're receiving directly and what the state's going to use their money for. Again, I hope we have more clarity in the next, I would say, 2 to 8 weeks. We'll get the clarity from the legislature on how it'll be split up and how much will be made for each of these things, depending on how they decide to administer those funds through the state. I suspect a lot of the infrastructure funding is probably going to go through the Division of Water Infrastructure and DEQ. They will probably be talking, I would imagine, at the State Water Infrastructure Authority meeting in July about how to use those funds if those decisions have been made. And at that point, you'll have a pretty good idea what they're going to use their money for. So for instance, historically, they haven't used their funding for stormwater. It's not been a priority as opposed to other things. So it may make sense to use your money for stormwater and to try to leverage the state money for wastewater and drinking water projects. Another option may be, depending on how they decide to use their funds, they may be looking to use grant money, but they may want you to be putting in money as well. So it may be that it's in your interest to use some of your funds to match state funds to get more bang for the buck as well. So all those things are kind of still up in the air at this time. The other thing I've kind of cautioned people, I saw an article by the School of Government recently as well, kind of saying the same thing. Prepare for the additional guidance. Again, we're not going to have clarity really until sort of the fall on final guidance, I think, at that point, and final rulemaking and additional clarification. So one of the things, for instance, we don't have is we know there's reporting requirements. We don't really know what the requirements of that reporting is for these different areas. So if you start spending money too soon, it's really kind of impossible to know right now what kind of data you're trying to collect to make sure you have the information to document your expenses for doing the reporting to the federal government. So again, I'd like to see some clarity on what they're going to require so that you know basically what to collect and what to monitor when you're doing this work. Again, it's a good time to make comments, to ask questions of the Treasury. The one thing we don't have at this time, because it is still open, is we don't really have a method to go to the Treasury. There's not a person to go and ask and say, is this eligible? Right now, they are really asking you to come to them and say, consider making this eligible. So they're still looking for that input to finalize things. When we get to that point where everything's finalized, I think by that September, for instance, time frame, then we should have things set up at the Treasury to be able to go to them specifically and say, hey, this is a project, this is a use, is it eligible? And they will be able to make a determination. But we don't really have that at this time. So when we can get some clarity on all of these things, I think it'll help everybody. But I, again, commend you on the conversations that you're having, the planning that you're doing to try to prioritize your uses. And I would say stay tuned for the changes, pay very close attention to what's happening at the legislature and how that money is going to be divvied up, what it's going to be made eligible for, who's going to be eligible for those funds, and use all of that information to try to really make sure that the money you're receiving directly goes as far as possible in meeting your needs, and also leveraging that state money to the best of your ability over the next couple of years to make sure you can kind of get your share of that grant money. This is really a, from my career, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The amount of money that we're talking about that's available, especially on the infrastructure side, is probably the most that's been available since the construction grant programs of the 70s. So, I mean, that's the type of funding we're talking about. So I certainly urge everyone to think carefully about how you want to spend that money and to try to do everything you can today to position yourself to be able to access that.
So Seth?
Yes.
I think, I want to make sure I understand.
Sure.
So I think think what I'm hearing you saying is that we should kind of have a plan but not do anything about it until we really find out more information, because it may be that we want the state through grants
Yeah.
to fund what we actually will plan.
Absolutely.
And then just use a smaller amount of our money as the match or as the additional, and then we can move that to other areas to spend. So we should have a plan A, B, and C, basically.
Absolutely, and that's part of the reason I put be flexible up there, and identifying your needs is definitely sort of have an A, a B, and a C. Know what all your priorities are. Do the work that you're doing tonight. Do those type of things to figure out those priorities and make those kind of hard decisions on those priorities. But then wait a little bit longer, if at all possible, to get some more clarity. For instance, I would hate for you to spend your money on something that then you could have easily gotten state money for, perhaps, and not using your money on something that no other money is going to be available. And the problem is you just can't answer those questions yet. So unless it's really critical, I would say try to do that planning process over the next 2 or 3 months, but don't appropriate it quite yet until you can get some more just clarity on what, exactly how to get the biggest bang for the buck.
So the second part of my question, so this money, the first payment we received,
Yep.
and then the second, we can legally just let it sit in the bank
You can.
until, what, 2026? Is that what I'm hearing? Or
Well, until 2024,
2024,
right, it has
and
to
then
be
start using-
obligated,
okay.
correct. So actually, the good thing is, and this shouldn't be that big of actually, from your standpoint, I don't think it's going to be too hard for the direct money to be spent from those deadlines. I worry more about the state money and how long it's going to take them to go through their processes, make it available, whatever requirements they're going to put on you. I've got a lot more concerns about how they make their money available and meeting those deadlines than I do your money. So I think you've got some luxury here to take this time to plan well so that you can make the smartest decisions about how to use this, limited one-time, kind of fell from the sky money, which, is we're all so thankful to have as an option. But again, make sure it's used absolutely the best way possible and leverage other resources as well.
Mr. Robertson,
Yes.
I want to ask you this question, because when I was reading the ARP plan, I saw that FEMA will be getting an additional $50 billion.
Yep.
Is that where we can dive into that as well, just like we try to dive into some grants with the state?
Yeah, so, I'm really just talking about, a few $100 billion of the $1.9 trillion total plan. So there are other funding sources for other agencies. We're still waiting to see some of those. I think FEMA is having some changes of the way they're doing things. I'm sure y'all are familiar. One of the issues with FEMA is they like to come in after there's been a disaster and basically have you redo the exact same thing that was destroyed last time in the exact same way without improving it. FEMA seems to be moving towards looking at doing, for instance, pre-disaster grants to try to do resiliency type work to prevent the damage before it happens. I know it's like the most obvious thing you could possibly think of. So we're starting to see some of that movement. So I think that's a possibility with some of these funds because resiliency is becoming a huge issue right now.
Seth,
Yes.
I don't know that the state at their level actually manage or participate in a lot of these allowable expenses. So the state doesn't have water and sewer infrastructure. The state doesn't necessarily have stormwater infrastructure. These are all managed at the local level,
Yep.
correct?
Yes.
And instead of, this is a $64 million question, but instead of the state sitting on this money and playing favorites to whichever lobbyist gets to them and gets the money brought back to whatever locality, why couldn't we as local governments petition the state to use the same calculation that the federal government did to give us our $6.7 million, take that dollar amount that the state's got, and then divvy that up amongst the local municipalities and let us manage it?
And that's certainly a possibility. I mean, until they make a decision, but ultimately, the legislature is going to make that call on how they want to spend that
Because
money.
what's going to happen, and we all know what happens in Raleigh, all the money goes to Charlotte and Raleigh and all the metropolitan areas, and then the rural areas get left out. But
Who can at least
obviously,
afford it.
this calculation I meant was
Yeah.
favorable to New Bern, so I don't know how they came up with it, but we need to be talking to our state legislators
Yeah.
about doing that. in my
So
opinion.
hopefully the way the legislation was written, there is sort of some catches in there that says if they're going to do this, especially through the water and sewer side, because it's tied to the SRF programs. It basically says you really should be relying on those existing programs from a priority standpoint of how you're going to use this money. I have no doubt there's going to be, I'm not going to use the term earmark, I'm going to use direct appropriations to certain people that have the right connections for stuff. I mean, it happens every year in the limited money that's made available anyway. But at least from what I'm hearing, I suspect there to be hundreds of millions of dollars that are probably just going to be made available through the normal funding programs. So for instance, like the SRF programs, things y'all have used in the past, I think there will be substantial grant money made available through those programs as well. And if you look at, for instance, what the governor has proposed, he's actually kind of flipped that somewhat to try to really focus a lot of the money on smaller entities, non-viable utilities, a lot of different type scenarios to try to really kind of push it down outside of Charlotte and Raleigh and some of those places. I also suspect they'll try to spread it out quite a bit. So I think they'll probably try to put some caps so it's spread out kind of across the state in multiple funding rounds. So understand exactly what you're saying. I certainly recommend that you talk to your legislators. I mean, there's no reason not to about either the way they're going to spend the money or when there's this much money available, if you have specific needs, when you can take your capital improvement plan and talk about the needs that you have and the amount, this is a good time to have those conversations and see if they're also willing to consider providing you funds directly as well. But I think it's a good point.
That's when we hired a consultant to lobby, so maybe we need to start with them to start doing that work.
I would give them the CIP. I would talk about all the challenges and needs that you have. Absolutely.
Well, this is just at the state level, correct? Is there also another version at the federal level we would need to?
There's really not for any of the money that's here. Obviously, I'm sure y'all probably heard of some of the other infrastructure bill discussions, and I think all of those are still pretty open, and we don't know how that money's going to become available or anything else. The good thing, for better or for worse, is for the most part, they like to take the federal money and push it down to the state through the existing programs, whether it's CDBG or SRF or whatever. So usually they try to get too involved at the federal level for some of those things, thankfully.
Any other questions? Seth, thank you.
All right. Thank y'all so much.
Thank you, Seth, I appreciate it.
Okay, the next item we have is a discussion on MetroNet. Charlie Bouchard will be making this presentation.
Good evening.
Good evening.
I thought it would be important to take a moment and go through a quick update on the MetroNet project and tell you at least what it looks like from my perspective and from staff's perspective. And I'll start off with basically a general overview. I've made some notes for myself. I kind of wanted to go through this in a logical order and not get too far off track and distracted because I can bounce all over the place. So if you'd be patient with me to kind of go through my notes if I can see them here. You know, I think we all know it's a pretty exciting project for the community. It increases broadband services and competition in the local marketplace, so I think everybody wins. Reminding folks what this project's about. It'll deliver broadband services to the home and to businesses in the community. MetroNet will be constructing a fiber to the premise or fiber to the home system, however you want to call it, and they'll also sell retail broadband services in the community. They're a private company with legal rights to use our public easements and our rights-of-way for the purpose of delivering those services. The City of New Bern will not own, construct, or operate any part of the MetroNet system. I had an opportunity to look at some preliminary drawings, and from what best I can tell, it looks like they're putting themselves in a very good position to serve the New Bern city limits, Trentwoods, Riverbend, Bridgeton, James City, Bryces Creek, and Havelock. I'm not saying that they're going to serve there, but based on the drawings that I've seen so far, they would be in a good position to reach out to those communities if and when they so chose. General impact on the city. As I mentioned before, they have a legal right to use our public easements. And from what our assessment is, it will largely impact utility operations, public works, and private property owners. They'll potentially touch every public easement and every right-of-way and every private parcel in the city. The utility also has exposure beyond the city limits to the areas that the utility provides service in, and that's quite a few other jurisdictions. So it goes beyond the scope of the city limits for the utilities operation in support of this. They're anticipating a project duration of about 2 to 3 years. It's really hard to predict how fast they can move. They want to move fast. They want to get the project installed and get out of here and get the customers connected just as fast as possible. And that'll depend on the resources that they can find to construct this project and how fast they can move. I would like to say, from my perspective and what we're hearing and seeing from MetroNet, this is going to be a massive volume of construction activities going on simultaneously and spread throughout the city. There'll be both overhead crews and underground crews. They'll be boring about 25,000 feet per week, if not more. I anticipate at least 10 boring crews in town. Overhead, they're doing about 3,500 feet per week, and about 10 aerial crews in town. From what I understand, they want to spread out and not clog up one neighborhood with so much construction, make it difficult for people to get in and out of their neighborhoods. But they also don't want one neighborhood to get, seem like they're getting connected before the other neighborhoods. So I think their plan is to be spread out as much as possible. So they're going to be all over our service territory. We anticipate 55% of their system is going to be overhead, and about 45% of their system will be underground. August of this year, we expect to see our first set of construction plans and where they want to be in the easements. October of 2021, this year, we expect to see our first construction activities. So it's coming like a freight train. It's fast. Between March and April of 2022, they're expecting to have their first customers connected. So not too far off, and good news for everybody. The financial piece I'll get to and discuss in a little bit more detail later. Our strategic plan as a staff, I guess what should be noted is there's a cost to doing this for our operations, and whatever that cost comes out to be. We're not presently staffed to do that or budgeted to do that. We believe this is going to be a large impact on the utility, and right now the approach is for the utility to take the lead on the project, and I guess that's why I'm standing before you talking about it. We want to work at MetroNet's pace. Our strategy is to support their pace, support their volume, do not delay them. So our strategic plan requires us to try to get them in and out of here and staff up and budget it so it's a successful project for them and they move on to another community. We want to develop good partnering relationships and stakeholder relationships with MetroNet and their contractors. We want to be proactive with our administration, management, and support of the project. And we also want to continue to collaborate with other North Carolina communities that are going through MetroNet build-outs right now. Activities to date. MetroNet signed an agreement with the city, as you recall, back in April, that outlines general terms of doing business. We've been having monthly meetings, collaborating with other North Carolina cities on their experience with MetroNet, so we've been getting some insights there. It's been helping us plan. We're also having frequent meetings with MetroNet and gathering information on what their project plan is, and that frequency of our interaction with MetroNet is increasing on a weekly basis. Internally, we're developing operational support plans and cost assessments and plans, what resources we need, our staffing levels, what equipment we need, what suppliers are available, and what service providers we need to support the project. We had a project kickoff meeting on June 2nd where MetroNet leadership came in and met with staff, and they discussed their conceptual plans, their processes, safety, key contacts, and they addressed some general concerns. Impact on our operations. It's basically the cost of doing business. It varies widely on MetroNet's volume and pace and the route they take as they deploy their project. Utilities, they need to make ready all of the utility-owned poles that MetroNet wants to attach to. And that means we have to inventory every pole assembly that they want to attach to. We have to engineer the attachments that are going on the pole. We have to construct the pole so that it'll accept their attachments. And then we have to do quality control and all that. In the process of doing that, we'll also discover other deficiencies with other third-party attachments that we can't ignore. So we'll have to create some work orders, some system to go back and correct those pre-existing conditions that we discover through all these inspections. We'll also discuss...
Is there ever a point where we have too many attachments, where we have to say, sorry, no more room? Because I assume you got
in many cases.
Carolina Tel or whatever. What's Carolina Tel now?
In many cases, and it will be ultimately MetroNet's decision of whether or not they want us to make the pole ready for them or not. And if they don't want to pay that expense, then they'll go a different way.
Okay, but I mean, do we get to a point where they want to be on that pole and we say, sorry, we've got 3 other people attached to the pole?
No, it'll be more like we can engineer a pole to go there if you want to pay for that.
Okay.
And we construct that if you want to pay for it, and they'll make that decision, yes or no. I don't think their tolerance for spending a lot is really high. I think they're going to try to keep that at a low level.
So Charlie, are you saying that in replacing a pole for an area that they would actually pay for that pole?
Yes. In order for them to attach to that pole, and we need to make changes to that pole, they would be responsible for those costs. So we have to manage that whole process, including collecting that money. And in addition to that, we'll also discover existing conditions that where we find code violations on our poles. We've had numerous storms come through this community. We've all inherited this system, and we'll probably have some discoveries of things that are not in compliance with code that we'll have to go back and fix later. It's not something that I'll be able to just completely ignore, but once we discover them, then I'll have to have a methodology to go back and fix those things.
You got your work cut out.
Yes, ma'am. The utility is also obligated to locate and mark every underground utility anywhere MetroNet puts a shovel in the ground. So theoretically, at every parcel in our service territory, in the city limits and within the utility service territory, and sometimes twice. And that's a cost to the utility to do that. The utility also needs to be prepared that MetroNet will contact our utilities and damage them. So we have to be able to respond, repair, and restore service to our customers when that happens. We have to maintain enough material on hand to respond to those, and we have to be able to administer, manage, and collect on those damage claims. And MetroNet's very well aware of it, and that's part of building a good relationship with them and working through these things and having a process here with our staff that we can manage that. And if we don't stumble over it, and we have good workflow on that, those type of things. Public Works, they are going to have to administer, manage right-of-ways and easement permits, resolve conflicts with those permits, and they have to ensure the quality control of the work that's being permitted. They'll have to do damage response and repairs and restoration on stormwaters and rights-of-ways, and they'll have to administer and manage and collect on damage claims as well. So they are not out of the woods on having some fun with this project. Financial impact, the cost of doing business. Again, the estimated revenues, expenses, and reimbursements, these are not, it's not budgeted. So I expect expenses to start trickling in as early as July of this year. Right now, I'm foreseeing a minimum of cash flow of about $3 million annually for the duration of the project. Obviously, that varies widely on my prediction and MetroNet's information of how fast they're going to move. But I think we need to be prepared that we're going to have to pay bills, and cash is going to flow. We have to buy materials. Some of it's going to be reimbursable. Revenues, forecasting about $170,000 annually, and about $284,000 per year per project. I can break that down a little bit for you. Pole attachment fees, that's a fee that we can collect once they make their attachment. That'll happen a year later, because we bill these on an annual basis. That's about $170,000. We can charge fees for a permit to attach to the application, or an application attached to the pole. That's about $5,000, about $26,000 in inspection fees. Simple engineering fees, about $121,000, and simple transfer fees of moving other telecommunication companies around on that pole to make it work, about $132,000. Reimbursements, all of our pole make-ready engineering construction work should be reimbursable. I'm forecasting that to be about $4.4 million. That's kind of where that cash flow comes into play. We also have to be financially prepared to make damage repairs, and that's, I don't have a number for that. That's as much as they hit, and how frequently they hit, and how quickly we discover it. Because some of these damages and hits we will not discover right away. Electric's probably a little bit easier. It usually reacts violently. We hope it does, because then we can find it. But you punch a hole through a storm sewer or water main. Water main, it shows itself a little bit, but the sewer mains, they may go for a little while before we discover it, and then have to go back and file claims against them. Expenses, utility locates about $610,000 annually. Conflicts with that we run into, pre-existing conditions that I mentioned before. I don't have a number for that. Just depends on how much we discover, and I think a lot of that can be pushed off to the side as long as I have a plan to not ignore it and we work through it through our operating expenses. I do forecast a need for increased staffing levels. Right now, we're looking at probably 4 positions in the electric department, 3 positions in the water and waste department, and 1 in public works to help support this project. Vehicles and equipment, we're taking a look at our existing fleet and trying to assess if there's any spare vehicles out there that we can use to get us through this project. We'll take a closer look at that in the next few weeks and see if we anticipate any expenses there. Next steps, prepare for construction activities.
I have a question. I'm sorry. Just for true understanding, is this standard? So we have to find it possibly twice. They're going to do what they do, and if they damage, we have to put our people there to fix it, and then send a claim to them?
Yes, that's an obligation we have to run the utility.
And this is in hopes that everybody in the city is going to want to switch over to MetroNet and get rid of everything else that they have?
I don't know what the hopes of the community is, but if MetroNet wants to come here, they have a right to be here and operate in our rights of way. And if they want to put a shovel on the ground, us as a utility operator, we have to go verify with that location and make it safe.
Okay, I understand that. I guess this is obviously new to, I'm just confused on if they make a mistake, we have to go fix it and pay for it and then worry about billing them. Why don't they have people there?
They're in a different type of business. We're in the utility business. I certainly want my staff to make those repairs. They're qualified rather than their contractors. I'm not sure what their qualifications would be. We're best equipped to do it. Anyhow, we're here. We have a vested interest in making those repairs and getting those customers turned back on very quickly and restoring that service. So I'd be hard-pressed to push that off onto somebody else. Or
No, I'm just trying to understand it. I just think that's crazy, but I get what you're saying. I would want our staff there too.
Right, and that's part of my our strategic plan is that if we start to have to change out a lot of poles, we're probably going to contract that labor out. That'll leave our staff here with a little bit of capacity when those things start to happen. I can have crews go immediately respond to those areas and make those repairs and get our customers back in service. So I don't want to reduce our capacity here anymore to provide our service.
And when you say the parcels, it's within the city limit, like every single lot? Wow.
Every single lot.
And they're planning on doing this and getting done and putting people on by March 2022?
Their first customers, that's their goal, and that's how, based on their experience, they see their first customers coming on in April, or March or April. And the parcels, for the utilities perspective, it goes beyond the city limits. It goes to everywhere that the utility serves, which is as far as Havelock.
Oh, yeah, that's right. So Charlie, will that service be provided just for lot parcels that have the structure on it, or vacant lot parcels?
Wherever they want to put a shovel. What I'm saying, theoretically, they may touch every parcel. If they want to set service there, then I'm forecasting, and how do I forecast where do they want to serve?
Right.
So some of my numbers are conservative, and some of them may be guesses. But I think the bottom line is we need to be prepared that there's going to be a massive amount of utility locates that the utility is going to have to deal with. And we want to be in a position that we can support that, we can do that in a timely manner and not slow them down.
Charlie, I have a question. I think it's everybody's intent to use some of this American Rescue money to help pay for this MetroNet. Is that my understanding? Yeah. So my question is will this money? It looks like that it would pay for the broadband if the broadband that's currently there is not up to par as far as speed.
Correct.
Do we know whether or not that the current internet provider can provide the speed that MetroNet can provide?
I'm working on that. I don't know the answer. I raised the same question. I've reached out to the North Carolina State Broadband Office to see if they could help clarify if New Bern is technically underserved and help us work through that. I've also reached out to some other consultants, and I've actually reached out to MetroNet and asked them for an opinion on whether or not the competition in the marketplace would be considered underserved or not.
Well, isn't that something that we should really find the answer to before we commit millions of dollars worth of?
Yes, and I think, like Seth mentioned a moment ago, we're not going to know the answers on a lot of this stuff for a while. So I think...
But they want to start sometime in July or something, July, August, something?
October. As the utility and the city prepares, I could see us incurring some expenses prior to that. What I would most likely recommend going forward is we create a project fund and to fund this, and then we give ourselves the ability to reimburse the project fund should these other funds become available, but at least create that project fund pretty early on so that we can manage these expenses and start dealing with them.
And what happens if it's not reimbursable or can be paid for through the American Rescue Plan?
I'm also kicking the tires and looking on some other grants. I can't say that I have anything on the hook, but I am looking at grant opportunities. And then if we can't find any other funding sources, it'll ultimately, when we true up the costs at the end of the project, it'll be on the fund balance.
Charlie, I know this is a guess, but what's your best guess at net estimated cost? So obviously we want to incur some costs, we're going to get some reimbursements. What do you think that we're going to have to pay out of pocket for this project?
Between $750,000 and $1 million,
Okay,
plus staffing.
So $1 million plus staffing, and staffing listed here roughly is 2, 4, 5, about 600,000.
Yes. And the staffing during the project, I would suggest that on the utility side, that's going to be absorbed by the fees, so we can cover that cost going forward. After the project ends, that be absorbed by our operating expenses, and those positions are needed now. So I think I'll be coming forward in the next few weeks, asking for those positions. Public Works, I think that if they can't find funding, we can't find additional funding for them, that would probably ultimately come from their general fund.
So based off of your knowledge of what's currently installed from an infrastructure perspective with current providers, we know that there's some areas for sure that can't meet that requirement of 100 megabytes per second based off of their old aged infrastructure. And the provider has told us that. So my question, sort of along the same thoughts with Alderman Astor, is we need to identify those areas, and those, whatever the expense is for those particular areas, should be 100% reimbursable. There may be some areas of the city that are not considered underserved that this money would not be eligible for. So we need to make sure that we identify that so we can maximize what we can pull from the ARP money.
I agree with you, Jeff. I tell you, I know for a fact, I hear it every day that Blue Water Rise has major internet issues there, and even television issues. The kids, when they were home from school doing Zoom schools, they were meeting at the Dunkin' Donuts so they could participate in class because their internet wasn't stable enough to handle the Zoom meetings. And there's even a large portion of the area over there that has no internet, television, or telephone service. And in a lot of cases, the cell phone service doesn't work over there. So I feel that we would certainly qualify for that area in there, because it's got to be some pretty low speed stuff over there for the amount of problems that I'm hearing is happening over there. But I'm just wondering if the whole city would be like that, and we would be responsible for the cost of the rest of the city.
I'd certainly like to put you in a position that qualifies us for that, and then allow you to make that decision whether or not you want to fund it from ARP money or not. But that's what I'm working towards, just some.
So aren't we kind of late with that now, though, Charlie? Haven't we signed agreements with them and to MetroNet?
We have a city agreement, in general terms, how we're going to do business. I still have to bring you back a pole attachment agreement to execute it. And but on how you use the ARP money, if we set up a project fund now and give us the ability to reimburse ourselves with ARP money or any grant money we find later, then as you find out more information, and let's say we're able to get the entire system qualified, then you would have a decision to make whether or not you want to come back later and use that ARP money to replenish this project or not. Am I answering your question?
Yeah, I think so.
I don't know, not along those lines, but recently I think we've all seen suddenly kind of step up their game and in different neighborhoods burying wires and putting boxes to houses and leaving wires on that. Now, does that require the city to go in there and do locates?
If they put a shovel in the ground. The electric utility spends on average $120,000 a year just keeping up with day-to-day work.
So you're already in the process of working with them on this?
Our contractor?
Well, the contractor is working with Sunlink as they're upgrading? That's already in?
What happens is the contractor, the digger, the person putting the shovel in the ground has an obligation to call 811. And 811 has a system put in place that they trigger the utility, in our case, our subcontractor, to go out and locate these. And they locate them, and then they put a marking on the ground, and they have 3 days to do that. And then if somebody digs before the 3 days and it's not marked and they hit something, then they're at fault.
I've never seen suddenly had to do that at my house.
It's purely up to, sometimes they go, all contractors, sometimes they take that process seriously, and sometimes they don't.
Well, I have to say, for some reason or another, I've had my underground cable replaced 3 or 4 times since I've had suddenly. And most recently, I have to say that when they were having to replace it again, I had my water, my sewer, and my electric lines all marked out on the ground out there so they would know where it was at.
We put in brand-new medium voltage energized conductors, mark them on the ground, walk away for a week, have a contractor working in the same area, go back out, remark them, because they want to dig, and dig right into our stuff, and pull it right out of the ground.
So do you have a yearly budget then? So we
Yes.
budget yearly
I budget-
for this to happen?
Yes.
So it's built in right now, anything that Suddenlink is doing is built into our normal budget?
Yes, and I'm budgeted with a service provider to do electric and fiber, because we have to clear a fiber as well. On the water and wastewater side, that service provider, their costs are excessive for water and wastewater. It's harder to locate. So we self-perform water and wastewater locates with staff.
Most of,
Is MetroNet going to do the same thing that Suddenlink's doing, I guess, doing underground, or are they going overhead?
About 55% of their system
Oh, that's right, you said that.
be overhead and 45 underground.
Most
They're going
of
to
the-
follow our stuff as much as possible and be overhead. When they got to drop down, they're going to drop down.
Charlie, tell me if I'm wrong or not, but most of the locates that were done are usually for a lot or two. In this situation, the entire city right-of-way is going to have to be located.
Right, so I was gonna ask, and again, you're the director, so I trust you and your knowledge. If this is something we budget for every year, and we know that this main project is coming in, is there not like a placard we can put for utilities that we know are here, that it's already been discovered, so that's not duplicated work or, hey, that you have to do is, because in front of your house, you have that, you know what I'm saying, or in the ground, or is it like a placard that can be put there?
Our obligation is to locate, and if somebody wants to dig 30 days after that request to locate, we have to go back out and remark it.
Oh, wow.
And
So are we allowed, I'm sorry, so are we allowed to, is there a standard set for them so that like it's not costing us, meaning if we're going to locate it, you need to dig within this time frame?
yes, and those are part of the details I have to work out with MetroNet when they call in a locate now. They're probably not going to call in one parcel. They're going to call in
The whole block?
a whole block.
Yeah.
And the cost from our service provider will be different than when one person calls all over town. And it's really hard to forecast what those costs are going to be until we better understand how they're calling those locates in and how that work's going to be performed.
Well, I know you said it was on your list of things to do, but how long do you think it would take you before you could find out if their speed qualifies or not? I mean, and then would it qualify in one section of town and be different in another section of town? I'm sure it would.
Well, first of all, the broadband money we're talking about in the ARP would only be used for city limits. So anything that I do, I'd probably have to split that out and itemize it to those expenses that incurred in the city limits. If I'm working out in Havelock, I probably can't. Bryce's Creek, just city limit areas. I would say, I'm talking to a lot of people right now. I'll probably get different opinions on a daily basis, but as Seth mentioned earlier, I don't think anybody's going to be real comfortable advising us until probably the fall. And I think that was the advice the options Seth provided was keep this money off to the side, learn as much as you can, and once we understand how that money can be used, then start making those strategic decisions. And what I'm saying this evening is that this cost to doing business is going to come at us regardless. We need to be in a position to respond to the project and be prepared. And my plan is to come back in July with a recommendation for a project fund and a recommendation on staffing levels, and have you entertain that.
Mr. Odom.
Charlie, just one last comment, and looking back at Seth's presentation, it says, this is where these definitions become somewhat obtuse to an extent. It says, households and businesses are defined as those that are not currently served by a wireline connection that reliably delivers a certain speed. So the provider may say, we're delivering 50 megabytes, but we've got pretty good documentation that they're not in some cases. And I think that could be some of our argument to get in those situations.
And in the electric industry, we have indices, so to speak, that we measure our reliability, and we can quantify it. You can argue it all day long, but we can quantify it. I don't know if the telecom industry measures that.
Maybe I'm wrong, but I thought Sutherland provided the service to you for what you paid for. Because there's different scales of service that you can get from Sutherland as opposed to speed.
MetroNet, I imagine, will do the same.
But if you go to your house and go to the website and test your speed, I get 5G and it's not 5G. My parents, they switched over to Actel or something
That's
like
Sutherland.
that. LT, I think, and they have 1 terabyte and it's faster. So, you know, we definitely need to upgrade, and I feel with all of the stuff that we sent to, you know, to Raleigh and all of the complaints, we should be valid that the whole city limits needs to be able to be upgraded and qualified, because we don't have good service, and we've seen with the pandemic, we need good service. So whatever we need to do, I'm going to support, because we need good service, and that's going to bring more business in, because businesses use internet. A lot of stuff is through the internet, so we need that, you know?
I agree. I reckon we should probably encourage our citizens to continue to complain, so we would have that for...
Test their speed and send that screenshot their speed and send it in. I pay for this and this is what I get.
The other challenging part of this is just an observation on my part that the federal government authorized this money to local government across the country to be used on broadband without consideration of North Carolina state law. From what I understand, in North Carolina, municipals can't go into the broadband services of business themselves, nor can they partner with private businesses. So how do we use the money? I think there is activity at the state legislation level where they're talking about this issue, and some rules changes may be forthcoming. So I think it's probably wise advice to table this money for a while until we get a better idea. Unless you want to put it all in storm or water and wastewater infrastructure, then in my mind that's kind of a no-brainer.
So Charlie, from a fund balance standpoint, if you're recommending that we start a project fund it with $2 or $3 million, do you have that in your day's cash on hand to cover that?
Yes, we do. Thank you. I'm not forecasting any tax increases or any rate changes. This is the cost of doing business, and we're going to absorb it.
I think it'd be wise, too, for us to contact our legislators and stuff to see if we can get a bit of that broadband money that they've got to help with this project.
Yeah, I agree with Dr.
I think we ought to call them and meet with them.
Well, I mean,
We just hired
oh, that's right. You know what, that's what I meant to say, yes. They need to go ahead and do that for us, but we contracted them out, but this is something definitely we need to keep on the forefront, because imagine we wouldn't be able to do it again.
Are they working with our state representatives as well?
They're lobbying any type of money that we can get.
Yeah, but is it with the...
Right now they're working with federal government.
I was thinking that.
But they said they would do.
Yeah, I'm all in favor of it. We need to try to get some of that state money.
I guess in addition to the wrap-up there, I believe MetroNet is planning on coming back on August 24th to give a presentation to the board. I suspect that is going to be more on their marketing plan and probably more on their customer service plan. But I have raised this conversation about ARP money with MetroNet, and I'll advise them that if they learn anything, to bring that with them, and if there's any advice they can give us. So Again, I'm trying to put us in a position where we can qualify. You guys can make the decision if you want to spend it there. And then at the same time, I'm looking for some other grants to see if we can't offset some of these expenses.
I would think that they would know their competitors' fee.
They have done the research, and they know it, and
Yeah.
they're compiling it for us right now.
Good.
That's about it.
Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you, Charlie, we appreciate you.
So our goal is to keep you as informed as possible. We've got a lot of big projects coming up, and we want to be as proactive as possible. Next item on the agenda is to discuss capital improvement plan and potential financing options. And this was originally scheduled for a meeting about 5 or 6 weeks ago, and so we're bringing this up again. So Mary Hogan will lead us in this discussion.
Good evening. So you may remember Ted Cole from Davenport and Company came and spoke to us, and he did a pretty good financial analysis of where we are with our current financial situation, where we've been over the last few years, and where we likely are going to be headed. I've given you the executive summary in your packet. Page 5 of that summary talks about the particulars of what we may be able to borrow and what basically our debt capacity is. We talked a lot about column C, which those numbers that you'll see in column C on page 5 are going to be numbers that will not include a tax increase of any sort. So structuring the debt in the way that he's got it here, we could borrow about $6.69 million and not require a tax increase. I would like to say I ran some additional numbers. He's assuming 15-year loan or bond, and he's assuming a 4% interest rate. I ran numbers on 20-year bond, which is not an uncommon length for a bond, and about 3%. I got that number up to almost $8.75 million. So we've got a little bit of flexibility, somewhere between 6.69 and 8.75 million. Again, it's going to be depending on where the interest rates fall that day and the types of projects. I think most of the projects we've talked about up until now have been eligible for a 20-year bond or a 20-year installment loan. So I just wanted to point this page out to you. That's where we're starting. Got 3 other attachments here. One is we did a survey of the board members. You guys remember I got emails from most of you giving me some of your priorities. Many of you mentioned sidewalks, connectivity, and several of the sidewalks. Sidewalks, maintenance, equipment, you mentioned that earlier. Matt was here at the time, and he mentioned there was a machine called a Dingo that cost about $100,000. He said that would also require additional staff time to actually operate that, but that was some sidewalk maintenance equipment he could see would be worthy of a bond or a loan. Street improvements and paving, I mean, the sky's the limit on that. I don't have a dollar estimate to give you. We probably need to sit down with some of the folks in the street department and see what the areas of most need are, and then what areas you guys think the most need is, and we could probably come up with a reasonable number there. Same is true with streetlights. We could put streetlights all over. Charlie, at one point we talked about an exact dollar amount per light, but the request came in from the board member that said in areas that currently do not have them. So once we kind of can hone in on what that number is, we could kind of see where we are with that request. Lights on the downtown bridge. The quote I got at the time was $500,000 to $1 million to do that, depending on how many lights you want to put on the downtown bridge. We got a request from one of the aldermen for a fire station. One of you up there
Who was
requested
that?
I'm not sure. We've since talked to the chief, and he actually thinks that our current need actually is 2 partial fire stations, one out in the Taverna area and one in the Water Resources Building area, as opposed to one large new one. So you'll see those numbers on here. I talked to the Parks and Rec director, and he had some improvements he would like to see with the Martin Marietta. It's actually not improvements. These are actually just building the new Martin Marietta Park. Some of the expenses there, including an amphitheater, which was also requested by one of the aldermen, and then a skate park. So you'll see this. These are the requests I have. It's very preliminary. There's no prioritization here. We're just starting with kind of figuring out, what do we want, what do we need? Is this comprehensive enough? I just heard the mayor just speaking, cemeteries, kiosks, cyber attack protection, more drainage, more lift stations, pump, bike paths. So I've made notes there, and I'll certainly add it to this list. I think that's our first step, though, is to prioritize what we, as a city, think are our needs and where we need to go with them. I also would like to tell you, there's a 2-page document in your packet. These are the capital expenses that were requested in the current year budget that are currently funded. So just so you know, we are doing other things besides this loan and bond issuance. And then thirdly is the big blue packet. This is the 5-year plan. This goes to the departments every year. It's updated and sort of scrubbed and dusted off and cleaned up annually, kind of looking out over the next 5 years of what some of the replacements and requests for additional capital are. So I guess what I'd like to see, I mean, we can certainly say these are the priorities. Let's do this. Let's spend this much money, and I can go finance that for you. The financing is the easy part at this point with your approval. The hard part is still just to continue to hone down and prioritize and make sure that the list of the requests is as tight as possible, as accurate as possible, has everyone's concerns on there, and a good dollar amount for the estimates for some of the street paving and street lights and some of those ones I don't have. So I'd like your advice on what you think the next step should be.
Mary, I have a question first. On the 2-page document under the total general fund that was put into this year's budget was roughly $5.3 million. Are we borrowing that, I assume?
There is absolutely, there's borrowing for this, not the whole amount. We have borrowing the vehicles and then some work for the elevator.
Do we know how much that we're going to borrow? Because that's essentially going to come out of our capacity, correct?
No. Well, the $3 million, okay, that's a double-edged question. So when Davenport came up with these numbers for us, he excluded regular annual borrowing for vehicles, because we have done that pretty much every year. So that's excluded. So the borrowing for vehicles that's in the current budget would not affect this. The $3 million for the elevator at City Hall absolutely will affect this. So half of this is spent of our 6.69 once we get that elevator.
So vehicles is only 427.
Right.
So if you take the 427 from the 375.
Right.
So that's still over half of the estimated borrowing capacity. It's already allocated.
For the City Hall elevator,
Okay.
if that's the way we want to go about paying that.
Okay.
There's some other ideas about that with, not for tonight's conversation, but we'll be talking about that in the next couple of meetings about some other funding opportunities for that project.
Mary, did you by any chance run that same formula for case 2?
No, I did not. I can do it, though. I got it pulled up here. I can do it real quick. You're talking about how much money for how many years?
Well, I mean, you had the other one for 20 years at 3%, and
Right.
it raised it up to 8.7 million.
Yep, I can do it right now while we're moving on.
Isn't that a moot point? You've adopted the budget.
No,
Next
that's-
you'd have to raise taxes the next year and beyond. Correct? That would be a moot point at
It
this
would have
point.
affected this budget anyway, because none of these projects were ready to get started.
Understood, but, so what we're talking about now, if we decide to move forward with bonds and we do a vote, or we do a 1-cent tax increase, that would be for the fiscal 22-23 budget. Correct?
At the earliest.
At the earliest. So, it's really the next one's responsibility.
So the first question I would just have is, over the board, are we in favor or not in favor of it? That's how much money we're going to. So since scenario 2 and 3 are off the table, we're working with 6.6 million, correct? Potentially 8.
And potentially subtracting the $3 million for the elevator.
Okay.
So just keep all those numbers in your head.
So just, my thing is I'm definitely big on the sidewalk connectivity. I think that's very important. Everything is important, but my viewpoint of where I'm coming from is I really think we need to put a lot of support getting Martin Marietta to a point where it's going to produce money mean, if we have the amphitheater, if we have all of these things, this is gonna bring in revenue to us. And I think that's important because if we have that revenue coming in, we can do more things. And the skate park, however we're working that out, is going to provide something for these kids to do. So, I mean, when we're doing in capital improvements, we do have to, think about within the city limits in regards to, the health and well-being and creating that type of, being able to have those luxuries. So I'm big on everything from Martin area and definitely the sidewalk connectivity. Those are some things that are very important to me for the capital improvement conversation. And then obviously, if we can get 2 fire stations for the price of what one would be, that makes sense. And I think we're hitting to Bern, we're hitting where the new development is coming. So those are important to go ahead and tackle as well.
Hey, ask a question. I'm definitely in favor of amphitheater. Sidewalks is not a big issue to me, but I'm always in favor. I mean, I would love to see something happening to the park. But why can't we go out, what would it be, an RFP or something like that, and see if we can solicit naming rights for someone to build this amphitheater and call it the Pepsi-Cola amphitheater or whatever the case may be. Somebody, maybe Bass Pro Shop amphitheater or something, whatever. Somebody I would think would be interested in the, pardon me? No. This is the meeting that we canceled.
No, but I thought when it first happened, we were saying, like you guys were saying, even last year that it makes sense to do it, but we just never physically put it out.
We started looking at doing that, and then when COVID came about, we just stopped because we knew the climate wasn't there for getting any type of sponsorship.
So is the client there now? The climate
Possibly.
there now?
And we can definitely throw that out. Now, there's no guarantee that we would get any takers on it, but we could definitely throw it out and see what
Well,
I had, one of the first things I did when I became mayor was I took quite a few folks out there that were not for me, but I took Susan Martin Thomas out there, I took Cole out there, I took the owner of the Bojangles facility out there, I took Bill Malin out there, and they had no idea of this amenity. And part of answering your question is when Foster gets that clock to a certain point, and the carrot is on the end of the stick, the donor will come. But, when you got virtually a vast wilderness out there, and you start taking a picture, unless you've got some pretty good conceptual plans of it, if you're not going to take the buck. When you get some of the infrastructure in the paved roads in, restrooms in, and some of these things, then you can get folks to drink. And that's what I'm there yet. I know you're fixing to probably take off on that, aren't you?
That's right.
Well, elaborate on that, because I know you have a plan for that.
That's right, and everything we've done so far, we've done it in-house. We just haven't had enough money to be able to contract a lot of things out. We have gotten approximately $700,000 in grants to do what we've done, and that's included shelters, restrooms, launches, general road, utility infrastructure, playground, things like that. So we're getting ready to do some more road infrastructure as well as change the entrance. Some of you have not been out there yet, and the goal is to take everyone out that hasn't been out and give them a tour over the next few weeks. That way you can see what that new entrance is going to be like. We haven't signed the trails yet. We haven't put our benches and things like that out. That's coming very soon. Staff just finished up the restrooms and working on several parking lots out there now. So we're getting there. The weather has not been cooperative with us, but we are moving forward with this.
Mr. Foster, what about the swim beach? I don't understand why we can't do that now. We're going to be opening up. It's going to be hot. That's going to be, there's going to be a fee that's associated with that. It may be, you know what I'm saying, but I just think like that's something to do. It's enticing people, getting people familiar with the area, even possible potential donors. I feel like some of these things we should just be able to go ahead and just take care of that now. That's how I feel.
What we're planning planning on putting out there is a WIVET, which is a water structure. So we would charge for that. We would not necessarily charge for someone to go swimming out there. It's wide of this space, so we don't have it to where it's basically a gated access. It would be guarded when it's open, but it would be signed when it's closed.
I think some of the things we need to remember, this is just my pet peeve, I'm just going to put it out there. But, you know, the city of New Bern taxpayers, we pay for these parks. Our taxpayers are going to pay for these parks, and we pay for our swimming pool and all of that. Yet we have Trent Woods, River Bend, James City, all these people coming and using our amenities. I hope we can put some structure in place where if we do charge for something, there's a fee for our residents and a fee for people who do not, or are not residents. Even though they say they live in New Bern, if they're not in our city limits, I just don't think that's fair that we fund the amenities for towns like River Bend and Trent Woods and these places, and we have to, you know.
I had the same conversation.
That concerns me.
I had the same conversation with a county employee less than 6 months ago, and he reminded me that Creekside Park's in the county, and probably 2/3 of Creekside Park comes out of Taberna, and
Yeah, but it's county, we pay county taxes.
Well, I know,
so same
I know.
difference. I mean, I'm just saying, of course, I grew up in an area where there was the Long Island Sound, and it was on the next town over. So in order to access that beach, the residents of that town had a beach pass that allowed them to go in for free. Everybody else had to pay to go in there if you were not a resident of that city. So, again, I just want to make sure, because you're talking
So
about...
what you're going to say, just to think about, now that I think about it, how is that going to affect the pool that we got going?
You know, we have a resident and a non-resident fee, and if you want that resident rate,
No, I'm saying, if this beach is open, I'm gonna go to the beach where I go to the pool.
yeah, a lot of people would.
So do you think? we'll
Some
have
people
enough-
don't like swimming in open water
Right, that's
because
true.
because of the visibility and things like that. Others prefer the safety of a swimming pool that has those built-in amenities and things like that.
And I just can't
Preference.
imagine, you know, I can't imagine it, but I would hope not to imagine that people would not think that we would not have to keep this up. So there's gotta be a fee. It's a benefit to live in the city, but we have to have fees because we're not gonna keep paying for this out of our fund balance or in budget every year. It has to self-sustain itself, so, I mean, I would hope they understand that, but it's a benefit to them. Like, a WIVET is a whole structure to be able to have fun and stuff. If something happens to it or anything like that, we have to be able to replace it, and those funds coming in, those fees, you know, that's what covers that, so, I mean,
Foster, again, I'm all in favor of an amphitheater, but when do you think we will be ready to try to find that right person to?
I think staff could do the research and have something out within a month.
Really?
For RFPs.
Okay, do we have any conceptual drawings or anything?
We do have some general concept drawings, yes, that was part of the master plan that was presented back in 2018.
and I know me and Mr. Pastor, we were big on the bigger amphitheater that helped more people.
Yeah, I don't want anything small.
Yeah.
And I got another question. Where did the name Seth West Parrot Skate Park come from?
Seth West, one thing we looked at, we're right here at Seth West Parrot Park, which is where West Newman Recreation Center is. We did a survey about 4 months ago regarding the skate park, and we got more interest in moving the skate park out of the proposed Mark Marietta Park because of the accessibility out there. It's hard for kids that may live in this area or downtown to actually get to Mark Marietta Park just because of transportation issues, as opposed to putting it in a neighborhood similar to this. So we looked at the possibility of moving that skate park onto this park site. That's why we.
Okay, so instead of having it out there.
Relocated it for better accessibility.
Oh, nice, okay.
Where would it go over here?
If we put a skate park here, right beside Heathfield, there's a wooded area over there, so we would tear out some of those trees and put a skate park in there.
Wow, that's awesome. Can we vote on that tonight? 'Cause I got 2 kids that do it right around the corner. That's acceptable. Wow, hey.
And, you know, there's naming rights on that as well, and I think if you're going to send that RFP out, I think you need to send it out with opportunities
for not only an amphitheater, but for a skate park and maybe some of these other adventure areas. I know I want to get you hooked up with Mr. Rexroad, so he would like to probably do something in adventure areas, but I think you need to go ahead and do the gamut rather than just specifically one or the other. Because somebody said, well, I really don't want to give you my money for this, but I'll give it for that because I see it's on your menu.
Yeah, Foster, I think what we did with Kidsville, whenever you had the different levels of participation, you could do that for Parks and Rec. I mean, let's be for real. Nobody's going to sponsor a wastewater treatment plant. That's the reason all these naming rights are being talked about Parks and Rec. It's not because Foster is the interim city manager, so our staff doesn't feel slighted. If somebody wants to name a fire station after them, I'm sure we'd be more than happy to name that fire station after somebody if they want to make that donation. But I think Parks and Rec would be easy for any of us to go out and recruit funding to help fund something.
Yeah, well, since we on Martin, we already have a park. Some of y'all might not be careful what I'm about to say, but I will say it anyway. I just can't see us right now putting $1 million into an amphitheater when there is grant money out there. And there's one out here called Outdoors for All Act, the support funding for parks. So, I mean, that's grant money we can go after for that. This is.
Well, I'm not in favor of it either. But I'm in favor of getting someone else to pay for it and have naming rights.
Let me say this much. Don't get me wrong. I think Martin Marietta Parks will be a great contribution to this city, and it's going to bring in some revenue for this city. But right now, my priority is trying to get this water issue under control for our citizens. Now, granted, is it in the public works, Foster? Is it in the public works budget for this year? I thought it was a machine called an excavator.
An excavator?
Yeah, is that the one that's for the ditches? Is that for digging ditches?
We'll let George answer.
Okay. Because I'll shut my mouth up a little bit if you can tell me, I'm saying this board and George, you can tell me you can bring in a machine, this excavator, that we will have as a city, and after all of this FEMA digging, cleaning out ditches and moving debris, Cat A and Cat D work's done, we got this machine that's gonna accommodate our boards and our citizens, and I'm gonna shut my mouth up. Now, is this in this year's budget?
We actually, in the stormwater budget, there's a capital line item for it's called a tractor in there, but that basically is an excavator, was what rubber tire excavator. We've actually had some conversations, Avery Smith and myself, about possibly coming before you to change the actual naming of what piece of equipment we go after now that we've looked at what has been provided for access by the FEMA contractors. So what we were thinking in the beginning has kind of changed our perspective on what we think would be best utilized to maintain those ditches that they've cleaned. And so we've got two options, the two pieces of equipment that we still believe can fall into that capital number. I believe it was $80,000 that we were given for it. So that's kind of where we're going right now. But yes, to say it can maintain everything, there's no individual piece of equipment that can do that. What we're looking for is things that'll complement what they've done, and we can most efficiently do it with minimal staff. That's kind of what we're looking at doing.
Yeah, because this piece of equipment that you're speaking of, this excavator.
Well, a track excavator is just a great big excavator, and we actually have one in our streets division. That size machine is a little large to get into some of these areas.
That's my next question. Will this machine be able to get into the areas where there has been problems with drainage? Problems like, I'll just say the canal, use that as an example. Will it be able to get in hard to reach spots like over in Washington Court?
And that's what we're actually looking at, is actually smaller equipment with wider tracks that can get into wetter areas with least impact environmental areas, but can still maintain the ditches. A lot of these have to do with maintaining vegetation as it does with excavating any material. The contractors have done a pretty good job of digging the bottoms out of what sediment was there, but it's new growth or overgrowth that we're going to see in the next year 2-3 years down the road that we're going to have to deal with. And that's kind of equipment we're looking at bringing before you to request it. The value that we were given in the capital number is probably not going to change. The number of pieces of equipment that we may ask to purchase with that money may change from what we've seen on the ground now.
I mean, by no means, don't y'all get me wrong, boys, by no means, I am all for Mark Park. But my citizens in Ward 5 and other areas of the city don't live in the park, okay? I just think that this $1 million here can be put some other place that's better needed to serve our citizens here in the city. So, I mean, that's all.
I'd like to get you wound up a little further on that. I think you were the first one, you and I rode out and looked at the culverts, the railroad Simmons Street extension culverts. And we didn't have all this wet weather. It was about 3 months ago.
Yeah.
And it was very dry. And the culvert was 3/4 full of water. Alderwoman Kamisha Harris and I rode out before the weather hit. How was it 3/4 full? Alderman Kinsey and I rode out about what? 2 weeks ago? It was 3/4 full. Is that right?
That's right. It was. And the pumps went on.
Evidently, when those culverts were set, it was back when Rennie's Creek mine was running, and it artificially was dropping the water table, or for whatever reason, those culverts were set at the elevation they are. But on the best, I call this the drop the level of water in Duffyville a foot plan, and that is to get an auxiliary electric pump of about 8,000 gallons to run all the time out at the where the 221,000 gallon diesels are, because the spirit of that plan that everybody's forgetting, it's been 15 years ago or so. The spirit of that plan was, number one, to clean up the environmental contaminants underground in Duckfield Basin. And part of that was a cascading man-made wetlands area, retention pond sorts, for evaporation and indigenous plant life ingesting of that environmental contaminant stuff, and the rest of it finally getting out into the Neuse River.
Right.
And so when those pumps are not running, the spirit and idea of that NC State University design to clean our environment cannot be cleaned if that stuff's not come into those man-made wetlands for them to do their job. So basically, Mr. Childs, those are variable speed impellers on those pumps. Is that correct?
The diesel pumps we can do. There's actually an electric pump that runs most of the time right now out there. But what you're seeing,
it's undersized then, because I've got 3 Aldermen on 3 occasions on dry weather have been out there, and those canals are full of water.
and they will remain.
In those ditches and canals, the more vegetation proliferation. And so if you drop that water 1 foot, you'll do the residents of Duffyfield a lot of good. So I got you wound up. You can take it from there. But I did ask you about if they were variable speed, because the argument's always, well, they only run when there's this amount of water, whatever. If I were designing it, which, by the way, I'm not an engineer, I maybe would have put the 221,000 gallon pumps, but it's kind of to me like having a house with a 30-ton heat pump, and all you need is about a 3-ton. It sounds to me like those pumps were designed for water event periods and not for normal non-water weather events.
So like normal storm water.
Yeah, I'm gonna bring it in and give it back. That I think you need to figure out a way to drop that water in the ditches and put.
Mr. Mayor, I'm sorry. When I had my conversation with Matt, and I believe you may have been involved in that, we're sitting in your office out there one day, that was kind of groundwater. That's groundwater, and it doesn't make any difference what you're going to do. That level is going to be maintained in that ditch.
A lot of that is correct, and just like the mayor said, when Rennie's Creek and Mark Marietta was dewatering down to extremely deep elevations, those ditches were dry. I mean, they were dewatering. That's correct. And so
pit or you know, to get to lower the level of the groundwater. I remember when those canals over there off Simmons Street were bone dry.
That's exactly right, and I've actually talked to residents that say
and now they've quit pumping that water out of that Rennie's Creek mine, and the water level in there rose. I remember when Martin Marietta, it was 50 or 60 feet down from the dike to the water.
That's correct.
Now the water's level with the dike. So, I mean, the only solution again, I'm not an engineer by no means, but the only thing that sounds appropriate to me would be if you dewatered those mines again and brought the water level down. Would that not work? Wouldn't that create a...
You might get a little pushback from an interim city manager dewatering his park, but, I mean, in theory, yes, that would work.
But George, I talked with you and former public works director, Danny Meadows, and in that conversation, didn't y'all explain to me about, because I asked you the same thing about, why don't we connect with whomever owns Rennie Creek and see what we can come up with? Let's talk about it. Let's sit down and talk about it. It'll benefit them and it'll benefit us.
If you pump that water, if they had a permit, it's going right straight into Rennie's Creek, untreated. If you pump that water over near where those existing pumps are, it's treatable. It's going to go through the man-made wetland. Yes, and so you want to pump it into the man-made wetland area so that it can be treated before it goes out into the Neuse River. If you do what you guys talking about, you're going to pump raw water that's not been treated. And
well, they did it.
Why would you not use the system that's already in place? And as far as dropping the water table, I'm not asking you to drop it 5 or 6 feet. I'm just asking you to drop it a foot. It would do so much. I mean, to me, in a perfect world, I would have a pumps designed to keep reasonably the invert at the bottom of those culverts we went down. Keep them at that level. They're 3/4 full right now.
So, Mr. Childs, what do you suggest? Put it on your back. You're the
Oh,
engineer.
no. This is a political question. This is not a staff question. This is not an apolitical question. This is an elected official question. And it's the flavor of this board as to what they want to do for drainage. It's not to put that man on the spot because he's an engineer. First thing he's not wanting to do is in any way compromise that water table. That's the engineering.
Then that's when he can disclose that information to us. That's why I'm asking.
Because that's swamp busting.
That's what?
Swamp busting.
I believe there'd be a lot of environmental issues we'd have to go back through if you want to try to dewater those mine pits again.
So then the next suggestion would be to put in additional pumps over there.
And treat water through the cascade wetlands that you already have in place.
Correct, and we do currently have an electric pump that runs staged before either one of the diesel pumps come on.
What's the gallons per minute on?
That one is, I believe, about 8,000 gallons, similar to what you were speaking of.
Why is that culvert always full of water in it?
And that's a lot of groundwater to draw down from a large area, I believe is what we're suffering from, and to try to draw the groundwater down. You've got to figure Martin Marietta and Rennie's Creek had pumps running millions of gallons a day out. We're not going to achieve that with that electric pump. So, I mean, there may be some options to draw those canals down. Avery Smith and I have made an effort in the last couple of weeks to have the diesel pumps on more often. They're currently set with float systems to stage the pumps as they come on. So we're working on seeing what we can do to get it down to a more acceptable level for the residents, but we're still suffering from the same issue that has always plagued lots of areas in New Bern, is elevation. And there's nothing the pumps can do to change elevation, and there's nothing I can do to change elevation.
Are there any aldermen that would like to see the staff do some research on the financial cost of lowering the canal water 1 foot on average yearly?
Yeah.
But who else would like to see that? Anybody else?
And have we discussed about replacing that pump? I mean, has that been an option to get a bigger and?
Sounds to me like you need about 15,000 gallon pump. I don't know.
Do we have anybody on staff that's qualified to do those type of hydraulics?
I mean, you got to study, the NC State study when it was originally done. It wouldn't be a whole, you you got asphalts on the whole project, shouldn't be a lot of trouble for somebody to sit down.
Now, the one thing I will say, those pumps were designed with that wetland system in mind. So similar to the November storm we had this past year, where we turned both diesel pumps on and we pumped over 50 million gallons out of Duffy Field in 24 hours. It overwhelms the wetland when we do that, the dike series in there, and we understand that when we have to do it, but that is the benefit of having the diesel pumps. So we need to be careful of introducing too much water where it doesn't allow the wetlands to do what they were designed to do. And that is one of the back-end problems with trying to do that, put too much water constantly through those wetlands.
So I'm going to be really dumb here, okay? Just because many years ago, my friend the mayor here told me, I'll do water and sewer, you do other things, because I do not have the brain for this. But if we're getting $33 million from FEMA to clean ditches and clear things out, isn't that going to help the flow of water and move things?
When we implemented that system, we automatically, Mother Nature and her drainage was gone. The system that the city of Newburgh put in place kind of demarcated the normal ebb and flow of water. And you guys have seen the valves.
Mm-hmm.
That's where that used to equilibrium itself with wind tides or whatever, or with rain events. And we pretty much, right down that railroad, kept water from coming in or out, and the only way it could get out, and can get out now, is through them pumps. And those pumps are not running.
So the pumps have nothing to do then with cleaning out the ditches. The pumps would then be a way to keep the ditches clear after they're cleaned. Is that correct?
And you want vegetation
That's what
in your
I'm trying to
ditches
piece in my brain
for,
here.
erosion control, but you don't want a proliferation standpoint that the friction is such that the water can't move through the ditch because there's so much.
And I'm trying to understand the financial aspect of this, because that's the idea. So then we have other sewer and water projects that we're asking that could potentially be American Recovery Plan, which one is the water and sewer rehabilitation in Duffy Field, which of course we have to redo a lot of that piping, but that isn't necessarily the same thing as getting the water out of the ditches or pumping it, correct?
Well, one other thing while
So
we're
that's,
on this, again,
I'm seeing all this different stuff and money, I'm trying to figure it out.
The depth of those pumps will not allow it to pump much more than what the level we're seeing. Is that right?
One thing we see, especially
and we
with...
were talking about putting a deeper impeller pump in to get it 1 foot less water in the ditches, because those are not low enough. Is that right?
Let me investigate if we can drop the actual float for the electric pump, because that's the size that we're talking about trying to move the water. See if we can drop it down 12 inches and see what effect that'll have on that ditch. We can see what that does. We'll need to have a static period of weather, so we're not judging it on moving rainwater at the time, but we'll see if that can draw it down. If that's possible, I'll report back to you and let y'all know what effect that has on that ditch.
Does this make sense to you? This is from a local engineer. The culvert was set when the ditches were dry, and it's probably too low. That's why it looks full. The invert is a negative number, meaning below river level.
Right. The actual the invert of the ditches and the ditches along the railroad track are dug to a depth below the groundwater, and which is basically below the normal river elevation. So a normal wind tide, the bottom of those ditches is lower than the river surface. So you've got groundwater and river. So that's entirely correct.
I know my stuff was crazy, but when I went out there, I'm gonna be like this on bingo in regards to this is not my expertise, and I'm all about innovative. I still think we should figure out a way to use that water and turn it into reliable drinking water or something. I mean, I know that there's science behind it. I've seen it. I'm just thinking, I mean, it's just, I don't know, or building structures where the water's flowing and it's a display or something. I mean, there's got to be a lot of tools in the toolbox to be able to fix this situation, because that, and we're due for hurricane season.
What the board said, I'm not quoting anybody, but there were folks on the board that said, this is not going to solve hurricane, but it's going to improve drainage. That was what the board at the time I was on, the board's consensus, I'll say that much. I'm not quoting anybody.
I agree, I
But
agree
it was
with that.
going to improve drainage. Now, to me, the only way you're going to improve drainage is to drop it quasi a little bit below the natural water table. And that's why I'm saying, put it down a foot deeper to get some of that water out.
How do we take all this, I'm trying to land this plane here, so how do we bring all this together financially, monetarily? Because that's what we're here to figure out, what the funds we need. So we've got X programs through FEMA, we've got X programs through the American Recovery Plan, and we're going to have X programs through a capital funding plan. So that's what's confusing to me, is the whole project consists of all of these things, which may be $50 million, $33 million for FEMA, $1 million over here, however it works, and then we see what that whole total is, and then we say, okay, we're funding this through this method, this through this method, this through this method. I think that's why I'm confused. I'm hearing us talk about pumps here and this there. It all works together. If the ditches aren't clear, if we don't get the water out, all of this is going to come together to help us solve some of those issues.
You got to have a pump that's going to pump it out.
And I'm okay. I'm not saying that I'm disagreeing. I just need to see that, the whole package, because I don't want to spend, what do they say, bad money after good?
I guess all three of those money funds you just spoke of come together.
Right, but where's the total plan? So the total plan is, we're going to clean the ditches, we're going to buy pumps, we're going to drain the water, and we're going to put lift stations, and we're going to put batteries, and that's kind of where I'm at with trying to see the whole picture, just from my little brain.
George, if you may know, in your experience, do you know what just an estimate of what a pump will cost compared to?
Depends on what we want to do with it. I mean, in essence of pumps, larger, they're large, and then they're extremely large pumps. There's a lot of variables come into that. In our case in New Bern, where we're at such low elevation, and we are affected by some wind tide, some storm tide, and we've had episodes of heavy rain. Any recommendation to any pump, I would recommend we have it backed up with diesel generators. So you run into additional costs. As for trying to draw the ditch down, I don't believe that needs to be addressed in anything short term until we take a look at the floats and see what we can do manually in-house to do that, to see if we can achieve that with some internal effort without any expenditure funds.
Well, back to my political recognition of other members of the board.
Excuse me, Mayor, but you still didn't give me a cost, just an estimate.
I can't give you a cost right here on that until I figure out what exactly.
What the cost is of the pump that's currently there. What were those pumps?
The diesels or the electric?
The diesel, when you say you would need the diesel pump?
Yeah, you would want those big pumps. We could be anywhere between $100,000 and $250,000 depending on what you wanted with generators.
As far as I'm concerned, that is nothing when it's going to eliminate water in our citizens' yards.
But my question is, I don't think you've got a pump I don't think there's a pump big enough to eliminate groundwater. I mean, the more you pump, it's just going to come right back. I mean, is there any way of determining the water level that's in that ditch over there that we've been talking about? If that's if that's the same level as that's going to stay there at all times, or is it up higher or down lower? I mean, it's groundwater.
I would be fair to guess if we shot the elevation at the top of the water, it'd be very similar if I went over to Oaks Road and shot the river.
So, and you can't pump the river down.
No, sir.
And the more you pump it and put it in that wetlands, the more problem we're going to have associated with that wetlands.
Turn the pumps off and open the valves back up. Just do it right back like it was 15 years ago. I mean, the residents over there would be better off if you've never done it, if you're not going to use the design plan. You need to get whoever from NC State or professor come out here and re-explain. It was when you shut them valves off, that meant you were pumping water, not gravity feeding it back out to the river. And part of it, the spirit was to improve drainage. The only way you improve drainage in areas like you said, the 2-foot levels and all that, you pump it. You pump some of it. I'm not telling you to pump 90 million gallons a day. I'm telling you to pump 1 foot more than is already there. Now, if you don't want to do that, just open the valves up and give the residents the courtesy of what nature used to offer. That is, sometimes the wind blows the water out and the ditches are dry, and sometimes it brings it in and the ditches are higher than they are now. But I think from what my 2 cents worth, you'd be better just to open the valves up and just go back to the way you had it before, than to not use these assets that are here that are not being used. You need to get the NC State people back down here
Well, then why did
and
we build it?
re-explain what the idea was.
What?
Mayor, you said your 2 cents worth, so I'm gonna just say my 1 cent worth. Because I'm looking at it from a perspective of back in November of last year, we had this winter stormwater, okay? And I understand what George was telling you. We had stormwater in residents' yards that took 24 hours for the water to get out of here. So my thing is, why can't we put a pump system in place that's gonna help, help the current pumps to just get that rainwater out of people's yards, that they don't have to wait 24 hours? That's my.
George, are we putting in, what is it? Is it Biddle Street?
The Duffield Stormwater Improvement, yes, and that is actually gonna have additional pumps that discharge into a different area that don't go through the wetland.
And how low are those pumps?
Those pumps are set down at the invert of the pond, which is about.
The invert of what?
-2, I believe, the invert of the wet well.
So, in other words, what's good in Biddle Street is not good over here at the 7th Street extension.
Well, I'm glad you said it, because I didn't want to give you the thoughts that was running through my mind.
Well, I'm telling you, everybody in this room, if you lived over there and you had to deal with the water that those residents have to do, every one of you would be dropping that water a foot. I can tell you that.
I'm all in favor of dropping it a foot, but I think we need to make sure that let's just make sure that we can get an engineer in here that can guarantee you that this is gonna work.
Well, Mr. Childs just said that he was gonna go back and do his calculations and then come back to us as a board.
No, I'm not gonna be able to solve the drainage problems in Duffy Field in a couple
you're
weeks to
talking
bring something back to you. That's gonna take a
No.
larger thing. But you do have to realize, we do have an existing contract for phase 2, 3, and 4 for design of additional stormwater work currently in the Duffy Field area. So we do have currently some additional work. Now, you and I, Alderman Best, have discussed further down at the other lift station if we could incorporate some drainage down to that area, and we can look at that. So we've got this in the planning. We've got supplementary pumps that are going to be coming online in the next year to assist in this. This has not been negated or pushed to a side, so we are working in that direction.
It's gonna assist on the Simmons Street side.
This will assist down on
Not
the
just the
Biddle Street. No, it will not do the North Hill side.
That's the problem, that's the problem.
But let me make sure I understand. This is fresh in your empirical data. The general elevation of the Biddle Street area is what? 3 foot?
Probably so. I mean,
And what is
that's
the
one of the
level,
reasons-
the bottom level of those pumps? What is it?
The wet well, without having the plans right in front of me, for the Biddle Street pond, the new pond, is a -2.
It's what?
-2.
-2.
Yes, sir.
So it's okay to do what I've been talking about for half hour there, but you can't, and all that water, I think, is getting discharged through a railroad easement out to the Neuse River.
It's going to go out to Jack Smith Creek.
Yeah, and so that's not treated, see?
Correct.
And you've got a
Well,
treatable
it'll be
man-made
treated in our
wetland to
new
get this
pond.
water out of that would be better on the environment. But we can put the raw stuff out at Jack Smith Creek, but we can't use a lower pump at the Simmons Street extension to do the same thing for the good of the neighborhood, the residents, and the environment.
The new
That
Biddle,
makes sense to me.
the new Biddle Street pond, the water will come into a stormwater retention pond for treatment prior to the pump lifting it to discharge to Jack
I
Smith.
stand corrected
So
on
it
that.
will be
You're
treated
right.
in some way. And phase 2, 3, and 4, they're going to do supplemental wetland areas to get the water to this pond, which will, there again, just assist in treating the water.
Well, that's gonna solve some problems over on the Biddle Street side, but it's not gonna solve the Simmons and Washington Court and Hazel and all that area, and North Hills. And that's my concerns. You know, if we're trying to eliminate water on one side of the city, let's get it, let's kind of expedite it to try to get it eliminated on another side of the city. And a lot of people are misunderstanding when you say Duffy Field. And see, that is a problem there because Duffy Field is split up.
And I
Which way is
believe
Duffy Field?
I believe that term was used as the greater Duffy Field
Yeah,
area. It was
exactly.
kind of how, because it's going to incorporate more than just that Bill Street Pond area when
Yes.
we're done.
So I just hope that this board, what you've heard tonight, that you would take it under consideration and that you would look into it as if you were one of those residents that lived over there and you get normal storm water. I'm not talking about hurricanes because that's something that's a whole different beast. But I'm talking about you having to come home from work and you get out your car and you gotta wade through water and it takes 24 hours for that water to move out of here. We just gotta have some other operation, some other system in place that's gonna help expedite that water problem over on the 7th Street. And George, by no means am I, jumping on you, but you and I and Avery and Matt have had some discussions about this. And, you and I was in a meeting, and so was you, Mayor, and Alderman Astor, when you met with Mark Stevens, and there was supposed to have been some kind of plans or something coming up, and that meeting did not take place. So I don't know if this is something that Avery and you might want to go back and look at, because Mark had some very good ideas.
And we have gone over that plan of attempting to pump that, but there's several difficulties there, and I'll just give you a couple of them. One, we do not own that canal. That canal is owned by North Carolina Railroad, so we have no right to be in it.
Add that to the list of things we're going to talk to North Carolina Railroad.
So that brings up one issue. The second is, if we start trying to dewater that canal is also tied to wetland pockets that are behind the county social services and buildings on Noose Boulevard. So when we start drawing down ditches that are tied to, that are holding water at the same elevation as a jurisdictional wetland, we've now dewatered a wetland.
We'll put a demarcation and send that water down to the Mark Marietta. Gravity feed it down that way. Put a demarcation, put the water from North Hills on back to them pumps, get it out, just like you do it on Bill Street. Send the rest of that water down there, gravity feed it down there to the Mark Marietta basin. You might have to drop the ditch a little bit. Got a little crown in it, but you can do that.
All I can say is just trust that we work at it every day, and I know y'all, I hope that you do see some of our efforts in the field when we do clean these ditches, and we do work on these larger projects of Duffy Field improvement.
What I don't get, seriously, I mean, I appreciate everything that the officials, the apolitical staff does. I appreciate what the elected officials do, the political arm of the city. But what I don't understand is you come up with a model to help some folks in the Bill Street, and you got, that's a micro, and you got a macro, the same thing, a model of the Bill Street, already there with the 7th Street, the whole layout of it, and I can't get anybody to figure out how to get the water down a foot. I don't want that ditch dry. A dry ditch is not a good thing either. It creates more problems than being too wet, because you start getting erosion and stuff when it's dry, and then all of a sudden you get heavy rain. So I'm not trying to get those ditches dry. I'm actually just trying to get some relief for the residents over there. And again, I tell you, anybody in this room that had the water, because I'm in a real estate appraisal business, I deal with it for 40 years now, and I know what these folks have to deal with. And it's just, it's just a little stressful to me when
What's the issue, Mayor? I don't understand what the issue is. We're talking about this. I don't see anybody that is disagreeing that we shouldn't do something. Just add it to the pile. Let's go ahead and move on. We got this. We want, I don't think any of us disagree that we don't want people to get the water out of their front yard. I'm all for that because we have seen the results. I support that. Let's do it. Let's add it to the list. Let's get the funding and let's do it because I think it's important.
And I'm all in favor of doing it as well, as long as it's doable. I think we need somebody.
Sounds like it is.
Well, I don't know. I mean, can you pump down groundwater is the question, and if
Yeah,
you do.
Middle Street says you can.
And if you do, if you put it in our wetlands over there, are you going to create more problems? I mean, you just said that it was creating problems.
Let's hire an
So,
expert in the field and
if
bring
we
them
can
in.
hire somebody to come in here and tell us, you know, this, it can or can't be done, I'm all in favor of it.
We can go all day. I know the majority of us, we definitely want to get it taken care of. So if we got to put money on the table to have the biggest expert come in here and aerial zoom and look and figure out, and that's what we need to do. 'Cause at the end of the day, we need to leave, period. However we get it done, it needs to be done. I have 3 homeowners today. I went out for 2 hours driving around, and that's not fair. They pay taxes, and it needs to be released. And regardless of all the stuff that we have going on, that is a top priority, and it needs to be done.
Well, the
But I
same-
respect the staff and the timeline. We just have to work together, and I'm about, let's be creative and innovative, because there's gotta be innovative ways that we can reduce and create relief for these communities and what we're doing, whether it's buying up land or land that, you know, all of this extra land we have, continuing to make people in pocket waterways and things, and we need to figure it out.
Well, you know, I agree with you and the mayor as well. And the same approach that we took in the same project that's the one over on Middle Street, why can't we, you know, go ahead on and discuss that, not tonight, but discuss that and go ahead and implement that same project? Is that something feasible?
We can certainly extend what we're looking at in the Duffy Field, phase 2, 3, and 4, just to extend it out. That's not out of the realm of possibility.
I'm wound down now, so.
Mr. Hughes, I told you I was gonna get you wound up
No,
on that.
you got wound up too, and I thank you, because it's a dire need. There's something that it's been overlooked now for decades, and it needs to be addressed.
But I will say this. I think all of our staff work hard to
Yes, they
do
do.
everything that we need to do, but we're up against a situation where we were hit with a major hurricane, and we're getting those ditches out. At the same time, we're trying to get the ditches out, it was raining for a whole 2 weeks straight. So it's like, you're in a boat with a hole in it, trying to figure it out, so I get it. But, you know, we just gotta figure it out a lot faster, because regular rain and stuff is not gonna stop.
Well, we've given you a lot of information to think about tonight, and staff certainly has a lot that they've got to work on as well. So, does anyone else have any questions for us?
Oh, yeah, I do. I thought we was going around the room. I'm sorry if I jumped in on something, but we were talking about Martin Marietta Park. I think we really need to have more money available for sidewalk maintenance improvements. And I am not in favor of putting some LED lights on the downtown bridge. Is that bridge maintained by the state?
That price was $75,000 about 3 years ago, so I don't know where the million came from.
Yeah, and I don't know, I didn't put that
Who
on.
maintains that bridge? The state, right?
State.
I believe so.
And I didn't know that you could, I thought it had something to do with the airport, that you couldn't light it up.
No,
These would be lights under.
We did it during the when we first opened the bridge.
Right,
It was temporary lighting.
And
And
300.
they said, I think you could downlight it, but you're not supposed to, they don't want you to uplight it.
I'm with you on that.
It was
Barbara.
pretty. It looked nice. It would be a wonderful asset, you know, but
Or maybe we need to talk to the state and tell them to sponsor
Right,
it.
maybe we can get the lights sponsored. Bridge lights sponsored.
I think that was Mark.
And I'm all in
Okay.
I'm all in favor of the fire stations. I mean, that's a no-brainer for our citizens. You know, we care about the health and welfare of our citizens. That's a no-brainer. Now, the skate park, if we're gonna have all these other amenities at Martin Marietta Park, I'm all for the skate park, don't get me wrong, but I think that's just something that we can hold off on for a while. Like, I think it was the mayor that said that, you know, we get Martin Marietta Park up and running, and, you know, we're gonna be getting some revenue from it. We're gonna have more people coming in to utilize that park, but.
what about some of our street improvements, you know?
a sidewalk sweeper, yeah, I'm all for that.
Bobby, you've said it a couple times, because obviously you're passionate about that. What specific streets do you have in mind that they're below acceptable condition?
Well, why don't we ask George? I mean, he's got the list of them, but I can tell you, I called their office 2 or 3 times this week already about issues with streets that we've got. And I hate to say it, I mean, I really do, but the streets in Taberna, no older than what they are falling apart. I mean, we've had a car to bottom out in the dip in some of the streets where they're sinking. I mean, and it's the city's fault because evidently they didn't do a very good job of inspections, you know, when they were built. But the streets out there are absolutely terrible. The streets, there's city streets all over New Bern that are in terrible shape.
So George, wouldn't the assessment that we had done by the outside consulting group, wouldn't that identify a dip or other deficiencies in the roads?
Even in Carolina Colors, it's terrible. Drive through Carolina Colors and it's like riding in a...
The current grading system that we're using now that was done 4 years ago based it off of just asphalt condition. Meaning you could have had, as long as the asphalt condition, the asphalt wasn't falling or coming apart, alligatoring, then that was what it was rating. It was not rating actual ride quality. When we're going into, after next year, we're going to, in our 5-year window, we're going to go back and have them reevaluated. This time, we're going to include ride quality in that overall assessment of the roads because we agree just the asphalt assessment alone doesn't really give you a fair, it gives you a good idea that the road's not coming apart. You may not want to ride up and down it, but the asphalt's holding together. So this new grading system will grade that as ride quality also.
The road that you turn beside Creekside School to go back up in Colors, that was Waterscape, right? Well, that area from that school up to that circle, if you ride, it's just like this. Everywhere that whoever put a pipe across the road is all settled down and it's got a big old hump in it. The manhole covers on Taberna Circle, in some cases, what would they be, an inch, at least an inch and a half higher than the asphalt?
I believe the roads have settled around.
And the hump,
yes.
they're all humped up. I mean, the roads out there are terrible. They really are. I hate to say it because the subdivision's so new. Well, it's over 20 years old now,
years
but.
old, yes.
I'm a big like that, don't we have the street and the numbers and it was a non-green?
Yeah.
So where do they lie on that?
Well, I don't know. I don't know where it lies
That's
on.
what he said, that didn't measure the ride quality, it just measured the condition of the asphalt.
Okay.
Just the integrity of the asphalt, not the ride quality. Our new one, like I say, coming forward next year when we have it done, we'll take into consideration ride quality as well.
When you drive down to Bern Circle, it's like dodge a manhole cover or dodge a water valve cover or something. You're constantly driving like this because if you hit them, they're so much higher than the asphalt.
Can we add Simmons on there? What's going on with Simmons?
Well, that's the state road.
Well, can we buy Simmons or something? Because, I mean, I had to get my car realigned. Jesus.
It's terrible. And there's a lot of, I mean, I know you've got a list, but and I know we spent a lot of money on paving in the past several years, but there's a lot that needs to be done.
So can we just give them time to, or have, if they're working on leveling the ditches, then we need to contract someone out to go ahead and just go through and do a reevaluation on the drive quality and then go from there, based on what we decide to do?
That's what we're gonna do, I think, right?
You're already doing that?
We've got our paving list for this upcoming fiscal year already set out, so I can send that back out to y'all, and that was based on wards and the grades of the road. So we've selected ones with lower grades that we feel need to be done. I'll resend that to all of y'all so you can look at it. So we've got this upcoming year kind of slotted for what is in our budget to pave. Then we'll have the reevaluation done, and then that'll give us a new round of grading system to see where ride quality has also been
What,
incorporated.
you
into
have
that.
$400,000 in paving this year's
I
budget?
believe that's correct.
I
It's two,
think it was $400,000.
250.
$250,000?
Yeah, well, yes.
How many feet will that pave?
That's one of those tough questions. Depends on the street, depends on the width and the condition and whether we need to full
You have
mill
a
the
few
road.
blocks. What did this cost you to do Arbonne, you remember?
I believe Arbonne and the two roads in Bern, I believe, were about $112,000.
And they were only a few blocks long.
Well, you know, since we're on streets, I think, I hope, I don't know if it is, that Lincoln Street is on that list of streets to improve. And you know what I'm speaking of?
I'll have to go back and look at that list. We've gone through several reiterations of it due to water resources needs to do upgrades on roads.
Yeah, this is in reference to the two trees that was in this street and cars couldn't pass. That's what I'm talking about.
We have evaluated those trees, and we'll have some additional discussion about the need to take those trees down.
No, I'm talking about the street now where those trees.
Where the trees were. Yes, ma'am.
They are out and they were taken out, so.
And we still have two additional trees, I believe, along that right away. Yes, ma'am.
All right, for getting the street widened. Thank you, George.
Board, what else do we have financially to talk about?
Well, I think it's also important for us to determine first, you know, how much money do we want to actually ask for through a bond? I mean, do we want to ask for the $8.7 million or for capital improvements, or do we want to go for, do we need $10 million, $20 million? I mean, we need to kind of determine.
That's what they're trying to get direction from us. I don't want to raise taxes, so I'm on.
And it's really going to depend on the projects that the board is interested in, not including grants we may already be applying for certain things, or what's already in the budget, or what's in the capital budget. So, yeah, we've got a lot to look at. Or what's included in the American Rescue Plan funding, what could be in that.
Would the American Rescue Plan build fire stations?
I don't believe it.
No.
Might do some of the ditch work, though.
Well, I want to just update you a little bit. You know, City Hall, we've been working on that. We've gotten some money, but, you know, of course, through doing that building, they've really uncovered some other issues that they're finding, such as, you know, water has been getting in that building for many years, finding some things. You'll be really pleased. I got to, you know, look at it today, and y'all are going to be so pleased. It's looking so good. But they still, you know, as I told you the last time, the stairs are coming apart from the wall. There's other fixes that we're going to have to make in there, some upgrades. You'll see a lot of upgrades for the technical stuff, all the wiring and everything. Now you won't see all those wires on the floor. They've done a great job with that, but there's some more things that we need to do. So I think we thought there'd have to be about $500,000. I know we're going to make a project fund. Are we going to do that for City Hall? Because we're getting some FEMA money, correct? Or
Well, we don't know yet.
Money?
Insurance money maybe, but.
And we'll be bringing some information about City Hall up at a future meeting as well.
So there's some funds there that that would be a capital improvement. And, you know, for the lifetime of that building, we're going to have to fund something to keep it up. It is our building, our, you know, iconic building. Once the elevator gets built, there'll be additional requirements.
Matt said just about every one of the windows needed to be replaced.
They've done a great job in cleaning them. I mean, you can see at them now. You know, you can see the sun coming in. It really looks good. But just, you know, we don't even have the money to put blinds back on or shades or anything. Well, you know, I think we could put shades back on there. I hear you.
Well, we're going to have to come up. I agree with you, Sabrina.
Yeah,
We got to come up with money with that. And if we're fortunate enough to get mitigation funds from FEMA to do some, what's it called, point tucking, which is what we've applied for, is passed just about every department in FEMA. It's in now, and is it in? I think it's actually in SHPO again for some reason or another. So anyway, if we get that money, we're still going to have some additional funds to go with it to complete the job. So I agree. If we're going to keep the building, we need to maintain it. But I also agree that we need to have further discussion with the chief or the city manager on these fire stations that are needed, you know, and I know, Jeff, your thoughts are gonna be building the fire stations cheap, just maintaining them, that costs so much money, and I know, but we've got a lot of construction that's getting ready to take place out in Barbara's area and Johnny Ray's area that we're gonna need some fire protection out there. Aren't there apartments or something already being?
The apartment is already up.
Yeah, but there's also supposed to be apartments coming up by us over behind, where the new, Seth Q was built, Q was built. That was gutted out because they were putting something there too, but I know we have Elizabeth Ave.
And there's a tremendous amount of construction going on in Carolina Colors right now as well, so.
Lake Tyler.
Pardon me?
Don't forget Lake
Yeah,
Tyler.
yeah. So we probably just need to hear from the city manager what he recommends at some point in time. We need a fly trap in here. We need to find out from the city manager what he recommends at some point in time on fire stations. And then I'm all about Martin Marietta Park. I am. I'd love to see the amphitheater go as quickly as possible, and I'd love to see it happen without any dollars from the city of New Bern.
I just got done speaking to someone, so give us to the end of the month, and we may have someone that's gonna go ahead and negotiate the amphitheater.
Great. And the rest of it, I'm kind of surprised that there's nothing else on this list anymore than what was on here, to be honest with you.
But if we are going back, just before we close out, to the ARP funding and what can be used, going back just to the employees, if there's anything, I know we have so much stuff that we have that we want to do, but I'm an avid supporter of our employees and what they've been through during this pandemic. We don't know. We're not in personnel business, but if there's any type of thing, anything we can do to offset, whether it's a bonus or something that we can do for our 490 employees outside of what they've already gotten or will get with their raises, I think it's important that we do that, because our employees, our staff is what make us look good, for us to continue to go out into the community and serve the community the way that we do. So please, 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 anyway, Miss Mary, when you do get the information, any idea, I really am in support of giving back to our employees any way that we can. I know that last year we did $25, but I think we have it. I think there's a way for us to be able to do just a little bit more in that regard. I know that, you know, if you do give a bonus, it's taxed, so maybe there's a way to put it on a Visa card, and maybe we'll partner with, you know, just those ideas. That's just my thought process. I really wish we can do, you know what I'm saying? Just, you get what I'm saying?
Well, Alderman Harris, I'm all for that as well, but now maybe I misunderstood Mr. Robinson. Mary, there's no way that we can take some of this American Rescue Fund monies to actually give to our employees, is there?
Well, it's changed. Initially, the answer was yes. We could give it to all employees. You could decide, and I think there's a couple of county school boards around the state who've already done that.
Yeah. Yeah, they did.
But I would say that it's changed now slightly. The newest understanding of the rules are that the employee must have been considered essential. Correct me, Sonia, you know some of this too. Considered essential, required to come to work, so they were not allowed, and they had to be working face-to-face with the public. Now, he mentioned face-to-face with other people today, but what I had sat through, and I'm actually sitting through another one of these ARP things tomorrow at 2 p.m. from the LGC, because there's webinars every week. But that's my current understanding, is they must have it. So is that every single employee that works for us? Probably not. Is it most of them? Probably so. And do you give it just to those and not to all? It's a little tricky. So
can we put it on the table that whatever is not covered, whatever we decide that we cover for our employees? I mean, I just feel like we're giving relief to infrastructure and broadband and everything, but at the end of the day, if I'm an employee, I'm not going to advertise whether I'm struggling. We don't know if a spouse or a family member that's living there has suffered in regards to their bills and stuff, and they're not going to come broadcast it. They're going to come in and check in every day to get their check and work. And I think the least we could do is give something. So I'm just saying, even if it's not voted on and we don't get 4 votes, when you do find the information, if you can create based on our data for our employees who would qualify and what the amount would be not to qualify, and how we can work it with our general fund or whatever funds we have. That is just, that is the second. Yeah, for those that don't qualify, so that every employee is getting the same.
I'll work on that.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Mr. Hughes, what else do we have?
I think that's it for tonight, Mayor.
I'd like to make a motion.
First of all, excuse me, so what are we concluding from this tonight? That we are, I just wanted to see.
This was an information session, and you have provided us with some information, and I think we've got some marching orders to gather some information for you for future meetings.
Thank you, sir.
I'd like to make a motion to adjourn this meeting.
Wait, excuse me just a second.
I would unadjourn this meeting.
Okay, cool. Do we have a second to the motion?
Yeah.
Motion and second to adjourn. Any discussion? All in favor of the motion, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say the motion carries.